The Construction of Reality by Jacobo Grinberg, Zilberbaum, 1975. Preliminary Note by Bending Realities. What is reality? Is it something objective, or is it a creation of our minds? These questions lie at the heart of The Construction of Reality, a groundbreaking work written in 1975 by Jacobo Grinberg, a renowned Mexican psychologist and neurophysiologist. In this book, Grinberg delves into how our perceptions and thoughts shape the world we experience, urging readers to reflect on the role of consciousness in the creation of existence. In an era where questioning established ideas is vital, his message remains profoundly relevant. Jacobo Grinberg, 1946 to 1994, devoted his life to exploring the mysteries of the human mind. A psychology graduate from UNAM and a PhD in neurophysiology from New York University, he combined scientific rigor with the spiritual teachings of Mexico's indigenous cultures. His interdisciplinary approach positioned him as a visionary, presenting theories that continue to challenge our understanding of reality. The Construction of Reality stands out for its seamless integration of science, philosophy, and spirituality into a clear and thought-provoking narrative. Though written decades ago, its insights remain strikingly pertinent today. Furthermore, thanks to a meticulous English translation by the Bending Realities team, this transformative work is now accessible to a global audience, preserving the depth and essence of the original text. This book does more than explain how we perceive reality. It invites us to question it and envision new possibilities. Grinberg's forward-thinking perspective is a call to explore the limits of consciousness and to understand how our minds impact the world we inhabit. Dive into the pages of The Construction of Reality and uncover a transformative perspective on the connection between mind and existence. This journey promises to challenge your certainties and expand your vision of the world. Introduction. The world, as we perceive it, results from the activation of our brain cells. This affirmation is the thesis on which the present work is based. Moreover, the only difference between the physical world and the world of our dreams is in terms of whether the stimuli that activate these cells do so through our sensory organs, external stimuli, or through an internal activation, internal stimuli. Both the reality we call external and the reality we internal internal are a construct that depends on us and, as such, is modifiable. The world and its reality are a description that depends, in its characteristics, on our genetic structure and our personal history. We cannot change, for now, our genetic structure, but we can modify our history. At that instant, the description changes, and change sets us free. This book does not pretend to be an objective and irrefutable demonstration of the above considerations. It is only a stimulus that, in some, will provoke changes, and in others will not. Whether the reader learns from reading it will not depend on the words contained herein, but on him or herself. For me, it has been a delight to write it, and with that, I am satisfied. Part 1. Stories. The Construction. The lamp made the inert body glow. The operating room smelled clean mixed with ether and acetone. The cut was on the right course. The femoral had been ligated and the danger of hemorrhage had passed. The surgical saw was giving off bone dust and ozone. The injection of the anesthetic had been the most terrible thing. L'Anil had almost resisted, but the memory of the pain was stronger than the terror of losing his leg. At the moment when the amber liquid penetrated his veins, he knew that it was no longer possible to go back. T-T-R-R-A-S. The sensation of the wind hitting his face was delicious. The speed was such that it almost seemed to fly. Riding the motorcycle made Lenniel feel that nothing was more powerful than him. The asphalt seemed to disappear under the wheels, and the landscape moved backwards with a dizzying and fantastic rhythm. Man, Lenniel thought, should always feel this way, master of himself and his machine, never an object and effect of it. The curves of the road were gentle and ascended gently. Lenniel was carrying all his camping gear. He planned to reach the snowy mountain by nightfall and pitch his tent on the very slopes of the icy mass. At dawn he would begin the ascent. It would be the ultimate delight to reach the heights feeling that the whole planet was supporting him. Lenniel did not see the trailer. The impact was so terrible that his body shot out, and after flying 30 meters, he fell into a ravine. The doctors could not explain the miracle. There was an exposed fracture in his leg, but apart from that and some scratches, he was fine. It was a real nuisance to walk with his leg in a cast. Although it was only 3 months before the cast would be removed, the impossibility of running, climbing mountains, or riding a motorcycle was desperate. But all that was little compared to the constant tickling and the desire to make it go away. The infection had started after that cursed night when, driven mad by the tickling, Lenniel had taken a long needle and, inserting it between his skin and the cast, had scratched the wound site. The pain was terrible. It felt like 1,000 fires that penetrated the knee and never ended or subsided. No antibiotic or treatment worked. The pain persisted, as if someone from the outside was whipping it up and intensifying it. There was no escape or refuge. Even sleep was hell. On the few occasions when Lenniel managed to fall asleep, his dreams were plagued by little devils who, with large knives, penetrated in endless procession to his knee. Lenniel became a knee. There was no other thought, idea, or sensation but the pain in the knee, always in the knee. 6 months had passed since that night. The pain was still the same, although it had transformed from burning to stabbing. They were waves that went up and down 10 times a minute. Lenniel had counted them 1,000 times. It was dramatic to hear that sick being always screaming at that frequency. Lenniel did not understand why the doctors could not ease his pain. He had consulted the best specialists, and none of them had been able to do anything. The only thing that gave Lenniel some help was morphine. They had been very careful not to addict him, injecting him with very small doses, and only when absolutely necessary. But, as could be expected, Lenniel needed the drug more and more frequently. Despairing of the pain, his acquired addiction, and the frustration of medical treatment, Lenniel decided to try other methods. The road to the Sierra began in that deserted and dusty town. Everything was brown, from the streets and houses to the clothes of the inhabitants. Lenniel had injected morphine 2 hours earlier, and remained dozing in the back seat of the jeep. The driver began the ascent. The breach was under construction, and the dirt dislodged by the workers' shovels and bulldozers soon covered the roof and windshield of the rover with a dark layer. After 3 hours of travel, jungle vegetation began to appear. The air became humid, and the mist made it impossible to see the chasm that lined the road. The jeep began to lurch, and, in one of many, Lenniel began to wake up. The scenery was breathtaking. The ferns and trees formed a dark, damp tunnel through which they traveled. At times, through a clearing in that jungle, one could see a valley that from that height seemed to be made up of perfect geometric shapes of different shades of green. Lenniel forgot his pain for a moment and was captivated by the view. He remembered his days as a mountaineer and felt a great nostalgia. Man, he thought, was born to always see things from that height. The world was wonderful, and anyone who did not know how to enjoy it while healthy was a perfect animal. It had been a long time since Lenniel had felt so well. He remembered that when he had gone to see the doctors who promised him the long-awaited cure, he had always been hopeful, but he had never been so sure as at that moment. Although it was true that he did not know the sorcerer of the Sierra, he had heard of miraculous healings performed by that shaman that some considered almost a saint. The jeep fell into a hole, and such was the impact received by the rear wheel that Laniel forgot all his reasoning and began to scream in pain. Desperate, he shouted orders to the driver to stop. The latter obeyed Laniel, who after a frantic search found the syringe. He had never injected himself twice in such a short period of time, but such was his pain that he did not care about the possible consequences. The landscape began to turn red. The trees threw their branches in all directions, and the gap looked like a river of phosphorescent lava that crawled like a huge Ophidian. The valley was a gigantic chessboard, all covered by a violet dome, full of large windows. Laniel peered through one and moved glassy chess pieces shaped like knees. The game would be a game of life and death. Each move of the pieces had to be made with the utmost care, and after deep reflection. The opening was magnificent, and his opponent, that gigantic fern, pondered for an eternity before daring to move his pawn. Laniel attacked in depth with the knights. He had to kill the king or else all the pieces would kill him. They arrived at nightfall. Laniel was still asleep, and the driver, a connoisseur of the Sierra, drove the jeep in the direction of the sorcerer's house. The hut was dark, and the smoke from the bonfire stove penetrated Laniel's lungs. The flames painted the shaman's face with orange tints, and his large gray braids gave him a ghostly appearance. Laniel pointed to his ailing knee, and exaggerated a wince in the hope that the smoky figure would understand. The sorcerer approached Laniel, and with a very gentle movement, uncovered the sore area. He watched it carefully for a long interval, and moments later left the hut. Laniel looked at the driver, and the driver nodded to him. After half an hour, the sorcerer appeared carrying a clay cup and several other vessels. He pointed to a mat, and Laniel, understanding, leaned back on it. The sorcerer took an ember from the fire and placed it near the clay cup. Almost instantly, the room was filled with a bittersweet odor reminiscent of the scent of incense. The chanting that followed had no melody, only a changing rhythm repeated at isochronous intervals. From a container, the shaman extracted a black powder that he sprinkled around Laniel's knee, while looking directly into Laniel's eyes. After spreading the substance, he touched the knee of the sick man, and with a sure but gentle movement, he began to rub it while looking at the eyes of the sufferer. The latter, who had never endured the contact of a hand on his knee, was surprised not to feel any pain, and almost reflexively smiled at the shaman. The sorcerer, as his only response, made a gesture of contempt. Laniel was transfixed from toe to vertex. A sensation of intense cold began to fill him, and his leg began to tremble. The pain that followed the sneer was indescribable. Laniel writhed on the mat and began to howl. The sorcerer, without hurrying, grabbed Laniel by the shoulders and smiled at him. Instantly, the pain disappeared. The shaman pointed to Laniel's knee, and then pointed to Laniel's heart and head. He extinguished the fire in the clay cup and said goodbye without a word. The return journey was even more terrible and painful than the outward journey. Laniel felt that he had never hated anyone as much as he hated that sorcerer. All the suffering of the journey just to hear a few chants, smell incense, and then be singled out in the knee, heart, and head. It was a sham, and if that wretched shaman thought he had cured him, he was dead wrong. The pain was still there, just as bad, if not worse than before. It went on, it went on, it went on. The office was very well equipped. Laniel felt confident. Surely he was a good doctor. At least his name was well known. "I understand," said the doctor, "that the decision is very difficult, but after so many months of suffering and the large number of failed treatments, I'm afraid there is no other choice. I don't want to deceive him. Surely you will no longer be able to climb mountains, but with the new braces you will learn to walk almost as before, and in addition you will no longer feel pain." The operation had lasted 6 hours, and, considering its seriousness, it had been a success. Laniel would remain asleep for a week, during which time the dose of morphine would be gradually decreased. This, the doctors thought, would spare the patient unnecessary pain and would also help him to break his addiction to the drug. When Laniel woke up, the first thing he did was to check if it had all been a bad dream. He lifted the sheet and was petrified with terror. His right leg was gone. Everything went smoothly for the next 2 weeks, but one night Laniel had a dream that made such an impression on him that he woke up completely drenched in sweat. He had felt his right knee tingle. The next few nights were a torment. The dream kept repeating itself, and gradually the tickling turned into pain, first burning and then stabbing. And it happened that night turned into day. Laniel felt with horror that his knee was still there. The sensation was as clear and real as if his leg had not been amputated. It was no longer only in dreams. Again Laniel became a knee every minute of every day. And it happened that Laniel's screams were repeated at a frequency of 10 per minute. And it happened that Laniel understood and pointed to his absent knee, his heart and his head. Internal. It was customary to get up early and go for a walk along the cobblestone streets, the fresh air, charged with the smell of dew, wet earth and damp straw. At the end of the street, the mountain began. From its heights you could see the roofs of the little houses that made up the town, reddish corrugated roofs surrounding stone streets. Carenitas made the route every day. When he reached the mountain, he sat on a rock and remained with his gaze lost, thinking. The day before, something very strange had happened to him. After spending the whole night heating the mixture and adding the substances necessary for the transmutation, he had realized that the goal was not to transform the substance into gold. He remembered the gaze of Porneus, his assistant, eyes wide, expectant, focusing on him. Carenitas had noticed that Porneus saw him, and that this vision must be very different from the vision he had of himself when his image was reflected in the mirror. It was obvious, transforming the mixture into gold was just a game compared to being able to become his assistant and thus see himself. It must be magnificent to have Porneus's vision with Carenitas's experience. He would learn more about himself, much more than by making gold. Carenitas rose from the rock and breathed in the mountain air, feeling alive and as if he had just awakened from a long sleep. The problem was not easily solved. He could not heat or cool himself, like the mixture, to await transmutation, nor could it be added acid or evaporated. The method had to be different. Carenitas was very patient. Every alchemist had to learn to be so, otherwise nothing was achieved. Therefore he was not frightened by the prospect of having to wait a long time before finding the solution. First it occurred to him that in order to see himself through Porneus's eyes, he would have to know Porneus well. For 2 years the assistant underwent the most thorough interrogation on record, but to no avail. Later Carenitas had an idea. He would sit in front of his metal mirror and try to see his own eyes. This would surely bring the moment closer. Porneus could not understand how someone was capable of spending so much time in front of a mirror. He began to doubt his master's health and to think, like the rest of the village, that Carenitas was going mad. After a year of being in front of the mirror, the only thing that Carenitas obtained was an enormous headache, so he abandoned this method. One night, Carenitas had a dream. He saw Paracelsus coming into his laboratory with a large flask in his hands. Carenitas knew that Paracelsus was the greatest alchemist of all time, so he dared to ask him the meaning of the flask. Paracelsus looked him in the eye, and with a very fine movement, dropped the flask to the floor, shattering it. Carenitas woke up sweating. Every act of Paracelsus had a very deep meaning. Having destroyed the flask, even if it was a dream, was a teaching that he had to try to understand. For 10 days Carenitas lived in the mountain meditating on the dream. He thought that by having destroyed the flask, Paracelsus had wanted to tell him that although alchemy was only a path, he had to travel it completely before arriving where he wanted to go, that once he had traveled it, he could destroy the tool, but not before. It was very obvious. Interrogating Porneus or looking in the mirror would achieve nothing. He had to get back to his work. The fire was burning. It had been burning for 7 years, and nothing had happened. Cairenitis was reaching such a degree of desperation that he felt he was going to explode. He had searched for 10 years, and absolutely nothing had happened. He had achieved no gold and had not transformed himself. Cairenitis took an axe and began to destroy his life's work. When he finished, he headed for the mountain, determined to live as a hermit. The cave was cool. The entrance was surrounded by vines, and a large rock half obstructed it. Cairenitis had found it after walking the mountain for 2 days and 2 nights. He cut branches and leaves from neighboring trees and placed them at the bottom. That would be his bed. He looked for a birch trunk, and with his bare hands removed the bark. He moved it to the cave and with great labor placed it in the center of the cave. That would be his table, and it would remind him that the center is the essence. At least that's what he had learned as an alchemist. The nights were placid. Only the murmur of the stream and the chirping of crickets could be heard. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a ray of orange light would come in and seem to move along the floor of the cave, and the moment it brushed Cairenitis's face, it would wake him up. There was no metal mirror, no flasks, no fires, no Porneus. Cairenitis spent the morning hunting. When the sun was 12 o'clock and the earth became too hot, he would return to the cave with his prey and prepare a lunch. In the afternoons he would sit by the stream and throw pebbles, watching the ripples that formed and crashed against each other. In Tanib, people commented on the absence of Cairenitis. Some said that in one of his experiments he had evaporated. Others thought that in his madness he had thrown himself into some abyss. Only Porneus knew that his master had gone in search of his image. The storm was furious. Cairenitis had never seen anything like it. The thunder vibrated inside the cave, and the lightning seemed to set his whole body on fire. He saw his hands full of scars and marks caused by the fire, the acids and the water. The storm painted them an electric violet. He touched his face. Despite the cold, he was sweating. His hands began to shake. Cairenitis felt his stomach contract. He had heard others say that fear made his stomach sweat, tremble, and contract. He thought for a moment and realized that for the first time in his life he felt fear. It's an unpleasant feeling, he thought. It's inside me like a leech stuck to my stomach. I can't believe it's caused by the storm. It's just a natural phenomenon. Cairenitis trembled. He lay down on his bed of leaves and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. It was too intense. Too much light, too much noise, too much cold. He remembered Paracelsus, and seemed to see the fall of the flask and its destruction the moment it hit the ground. He felt the fear and began to scream for joy. Anyone who had seen that human figure come out of the cave in the middle of the storm and begin to dance and thank the thunder would have thought it was a ghost, a madman, or a wild beast in human form. Cairenitis thanked the rain. He had never felt such joy. His desire to see himself through Porneus's eyes had disappeared. All that remained was the feeling of having experienced fear and of having understood. Jantos and Or. Or was a very mature chief and had never allowed panic to spread among his people, and he was not about to start doing so now. It was true that the glare, the terrible noise and the heat had managed to alter his characteristic state of serenity and tranquility that for more than 20 years he had maintained in his domain. But all that had already happened, and now the only important thing was to rebuild the destroyed huts and put out the fires. The assembly of elders, gathered in the ceremonial cave, asked him for explanations. What had caused the appearance of the light, the tidal wave, the heat? Why had the sea changed color? Why, if Er had said that everything was over, were the dead fish still appearing and that ash was falling from the sky? Or did not know, so he told the elders, but he also expressed his disappointment that they had not learned that the world was much more mysterious and marvelous than any structure that pretended to explain it. The elders understood, and within each of them arose the certainty that Or was still the teacher and leader, since he made them learn. The next morning, the news was being discussed throughout the village. 2 human bodies had been found near the reef. One of them had severe burns all over his body and appeared to have died. The other was still breathing, albeit very faintly. Or gave orders to take the survivor to the village's main hut, where he would receive proper care. Or's greatest pride was his meetings with the children. At dawn every day all the children of the village would come to Or's house, and for 4 hours they would discuss their dreams, do imagination exercises, and talk about what they had learned the day before. Or told them that he had dreamed of his late father, who in his dream had pointed to the fruit of a tree, and taking it in his hand had examined it closely as he ate it. This, Or told them, means that real knowledge is based on 2 processes. One is knowing and the other is feeling. He revealed to them that in the dream, his father had indicated this to him by taking the fruit, observing it and eating it. Someone who knows, he said, is able to know what surrounds him by observing the relations of the observable, without at the same time ceasing to feel them. The children nodded in delight. One of them mentioned that the day before he had experienced something similar to Or's dream. When I was making love to my little friend, I understood that someone who knows things without being able to feel them really doesn't know them. In the same way, someone who feels things but does not understand them does not know them either. That is why true wisdom only exists when it is understood and felt. A little girl told that the day before she had understood that feeling had no limits, that these appeared when one fell into a routine scheme and when one was a spectator of oneself. She had seen a flower, it was beautiful, and as she looked at it, she had felt that she loved it. This sensation became so intense that it began to frighten him. At that moment he stopped loving it, which showed that the feeling of loving existed, until the moment he began to think about the intensity of his feeling. Therefore he would have continued if the fear had not appeared. Or thought it was wonderful to learn from children. What they said was the most profound and real. For Or, the day was highly stimulating. After the meeting with the children, he would discuss philosophical questions with the elders. Today they would talk about certainty and its relationship to knowledge. When the discussion was over, Or planned to go visit the survivor. What had happened? In truth, the elders were right to be concerned. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Or thought that even if it was the worst, it shouldn't affect him. While he couldn't help but be curious and concerned, the survivor would probably know. How his body ached, every movement represented a gigantic effort. He probably had some fractures and surely 1st and 2nd degree burns. Hanios tried to open his eyes. The light was burning and besides, that strange smell, a mixture of sweat, smoke, wet straw, and urine, he began to remember. The view from the astronomical balloon was spectacular. The sea showed a very intense color. The atmosphere was clear and no clouds were visible. His companion was busy with the barometer when the radio transmission reached them. They could only hear the operator's gasp and despair, and now those pains and the unpleasant smell. Or watched Hanios, guessed the sufferings and felt his desperate effort to open his eyes. His body was muscular. The wrinkles on his face indicated a person of strong character and decisiveness, or could not say for sure, but he felt he would learn many things from the wounded man. Hanios was amazed at Or's stature. He was a true giant. The look of that Goliath was strange. There was an almost phosphorescent gleam in his eyes, and his expression was almost philosophical, although from his clothing one could guess that he was a primitive man, perhaps some member of a tribe that had not come in contact with civilization. Or asked him what his name was, and Janio's reply was a mixture of guttural sounds and high-pitched tones. They would have to teach him their language, otherwise they would not be able to communicate, or asked 2 of his children to teach the man how to speak. The meeting with the elders took place 6 months later. Hanios was perfectly recovered, and his knowledge of the native language was now sufficient for him to communicate easily with them. The meeting had been Janio's own idea. In the last 2 months he had been seen to be desperate and upset. Everything he saw seemed to put him in a mood very much akin to a bad mood. The few times he spoke, he mentioned his disagreement with his surroundings, and explained that many mistakes were being made in the way children were being raised, in the way they communicated, and even in the way they made love, just like that, in full view of everyone. When Janios spoke, everyone listened and smiled, but no one seemed to take him very seriously. The elders were ready to listen to Janios, or had asked them to be considerate and not to forget that Janios had a history and inner experiences very different from those they shared. Janios began by thanking them for all the attention and kindnesses they had extended to him, or noticed the bewilderment among his people. It was absurd for anyone to thank. It was true that Janios came from a very remote place, but it was exaggerated, their primitivism. Janios began to explain that in his place of origin he was considered an authority for his knowledge and handling of science. It was inconceivable, Or himself began to worry. His children understood from the age of 4 that to boast of knowledge only meant that it did not exist except as data, and here was an apparently adult person who had not yet passed the age of 4. An old man began to speak. Janios asked him to let him finish. This remark provoked such laughter among the council members that Or was forced to intervene. He made a sign that meant, "Be patient," and the elders, smiling, understood. Janios did not understand what was happening. He would never have imagined that such a normal request was capable of provoking such a scandal. The tribe really was very primitive. He took a breath, smoothed his hair, and continued speaking. The academies of science in 7 countries made me an honorary member in recognition of my work. All this I tell you so that you will understand and not misunderstand what I wish to communicate to you. Or felt dizzy. Asking the council of elders for understanding only meant that he was being questioned a priori. It was the ultimate insecurity and mistrust. To mention the possibility of misinterpretation only meant that they were dealing with a being who had learned nothing in his life, and who had been born and raised in a society in full decay. The elders looked at each other. They all felt great pity. Janios was sure that the reaction he saw was a sign that they had begun to respect him. He felt calmer, and continued, "I have noticed a number of mistakes in the way they are organized, and above all, in how they educate the children. Believe me that the only motive that leads me to communicate all these observations to you is the desire to help you." Or, with an ironic tone that deeply astonished the elders, asked Janios to be a little more specific. "Precisely with that in mind," Janios answered him, "I will allow myself to mention a few examples that I hope will not make you uncomfortable." Or began to understand. That Janios thought they could be made uncomfortable only meant that he had been taught to disrespect himself. It indicated a dichotomous mentality that could go to the extreme of being ashamed of his own actions. It was obvious. Only a person who has been ashamed of what he does can come to think that others can be ashamed too. Or stopped listening to Janios. Thinking about how to make the transformation, he had to be taught not to invalidate himself, and that could only be achieved by putting him in touch with his essence. The first example refers to a scene I observed 3 months ago. The plan was simple but difficult to carry out. I would let Janios teach him his science, and little by little I would lead him to understand. You must change. What is happening in your culture will only lead to chaos. It will be enough for some dictator to emerge from among you to turn you into slaves. I would create a seminar. I would invite Janios to teach, and the students would be him and the children. A society without laws and regulations ceases to be a society by definition. Laws prevent disorder and prevent some from taking advantage of others. He would have to talk to the children, he would explain to them, and they would understand. The civilization one come from has a lot to teach them. If they would at least allow, I would show them how to achieve absolutely objective knowledge. In spite of everything you are saying, you must be able to achieve it. It will be very difficult and tedious, but with the help of the children, it can be done. Hanios had finished. He looked at the council as if waiting for an answer. The elders looked at with an expression of astonishment, and as if asking him if it would not be better to ask Hanios to return to his wonderful civilization. Or stood up, approached Hanios, and placing his arms on Janio's shoulders, turned to look at the elders. The look was sparkling and the expression smiling. The elders understood that, or had had a cognition, or looked into Janio's eyes and said in the most serious tone of voice he was capable of, "Tomorrow you will start teaching us." The council was rejoicing. Hanios had gone to rest, and Or was explaining to them what he would try to do. An old man began to speak. "Today I have understood that the lights, the tidal wave and the dead fish were the work of people similar to Hanios. We understand and approve of your idea, Or. We only ask you to be careful. If your attempt fails, we will all be held responsible, and we will understand that." Or looked at the old man. He thought that the end of life was always connected with its beginning. He said, "Han, you surprise me. A 2-year-old child would have realized and understood better than you. Don't let something so simple impress you. Remember what you have learned and you will never doubt." The children waited in the hut. Today they would receive their first lesson about science. As they waited for Hanios, they pondered the meaning of that rare word. Or had told them that they would come into contact with a world very different from the one they had always known, and that he had absolute confidence that they would be able to understand and handle it. Hanios showed up at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. Today we will talk about the necessity and importance of scientific knowledge. Science began the instant man asked himself a question and was able to solve it objectively. "Do you mean to say," CIR asked, "that science consists of asking questions and answering them?" "What do you mean by objectively?" Clar asked. "What I want to show you," answered Hanios, "is that asking questions and answering them is only a means to understand and explain natural phenomena. Objectively means that scientific knowledge is the same for everyone." The children began to get restless. Although they remembered Or's words, they felt that Hanios was very strange. Olef got up from his seat and looking at Hanios said, "When someone raises questions and seeks explanations, it means that in advance he has them. If he does this in relation to nature, he makes the mistake of thinking that it will conform to his structures, and forgets that these are always narrower and simpler than the knowledge he wishes to acquire. If he also thinks that this knowledge must be the same for everyone, he does not take into account that each one of those who form everyone is at a different stage of the path. To wish to teach the way, thinking that he will be able to transmit it, is to fall into a mistake. It makes those who want to teach think about teaching and stop living. The only possible teaching is that which comes from someone who is and who, therefore, is not interested in teaching." Hanios adopted the most peaceful posture he could, and in a kindly tone of voice, said to them, "Whoever seeks explanations does not necessarily have them beforehand. He has simply asked himself a question and does not rely on his subjectivism to answer it, so he prefers to question nature directly. The knowledge he thus acquires may not be understood by some, but that does not mean that it does not exist by itself independently of whoever understands it." Olef insisted, "It is true that things teach, but the knowledge is not in them, but in us. To distrust what you call subjectivism is tantamount to thinking that knowledge is external and remote from ourselves. The only valid knowledge is that which is based and sustained within us as long as we are free to know. Whoever seeks explanations knows that they exist and also believes he knows the way to find them. Both the idea that they exist and the use of a pre-established path means that what is found adapts to the path, which prevents us from obtaining new knowledge, since it is always different from the idea we have of it. Pretending to know new things on the basis of what is already known prevents one from attaining such knowledge. Knowledge does not exist outside or apart from the one who knows. Therefore, if someone does not understand a knowledge, it does not exist for him. Since he is the one who gives value and reality to knowledge, the fact that it is not part of him necessarily implies that it does not exist. Hanios scratched his head before answering. This did not please the children. They knew that the only knowledge anyone can communicate is that which results from a certainty, or had never communicated to them anything in which he doubted. He preferred not to, but here was someone who doubted, hence the scratching gesture, and yet was interested in talking. Hanios sensed the distrustful attitude of the children. For the first time since arriving on the island, he began to think that perhaps these people were not as primitive as he had imagined. He did not quite understand the reason for this feeling, but he did not doubt its reality either. He decided to end the meeting for the day. Hanios could not sleep. He felt a terrible emptiness and did not understand why. He had to analyze it and find out where it came from. Otherwise it would get worse, and the limit, he knew, would be despair. Suddenly, he understood. The feeling of emptiness had arisen at the moment when they had questioned the only thing he possessed. He had to show them the value of scientific logic. Possibly they would understand it if he could find the right example. Suppose, Hanios told the children the next day, you want to know how a flower grows. The first thing you should do is to know its constituent parts. In order to know them, it would be necessary to use a method. We could dissect a flower and thus separate its components. Then we would have to take several groups of flowers and to each one cut some of its parts in order to find out which is the one that produces the growth. We could change the soil conditions, temperature or humidity, and see how the flowers grow under the different conditions. When we knew which parts of flowers are essential for their growth, and found out the environmental conditions where growth is optimal, we could know how a flower grows. Clara asked, at what point in time, according to science, should we have the flower experience? Hanios answered that he did not understand the question. It is very easy, said Olaf. If we wanted to understand the growth of a flower, we should first live and love the flower. I understand, said Hanios. The wonderful thing about the scientific method is that it is not necessary to have that kind of experience in order to understand nature and thus answer the questions we ask. Almost in unison, the children exclaimed in perplexity, but if you haven't experienced a flower, how can you think you can understand it? Besides, what is the point of such knowledge? Hanios began to lose patience. What is, he asked, the meaning of living a flower? Luif, the youngest of the children, began to speak. Before I was born, you would not have been able to understand me. It was necessary for me to exist so that there would be something to understand in me. The flower of which you speak, you can only know it if you first let it be born in you. First, you have to live the beauty of the flower, and then ask questions about it. If the flower does not exist in you, you cannot understand it for the simple reason that understanding it also occurs in yourself. Janio's head began to ache. He felt that somewhere there was a misunderstanding, but he could not clarify its characteristics and provenance. Almost in a pleading tone, he said to the children, "Please let me continue, and later you will understand what I want to tell you. The meaning that science gives to the knowledge of nature is independent of the aesthetic sensations and emotions that are experienced when perceiving the object of knowledge. The two should not be confused, for that only results in a loss of objectivity." "We do not understand you," said Olaf. For us, knowledge is an experience and that is its meaning, but for you, experience does not exist. I am not denying the experience, said Hanios. I am only saying that the aesthetic sensation that occurs within me when I see a flower is independent of the knowledge that I can acquire of it. The meaning of that knowledge is to satisfy my curiosity and to give me the means to make flowers bigger or smaller, with colors or without them, with smells or with flavors, in short, to allow me to predict and control the flowers or any other object around me. The ability to predict and control empowers me to satisfy the needs of those who use or like the objects I know, be they flowers or fabrics. Olaf spoke again. What is the point of making flowers bigger or smaller, with more or less colors, if with one of the existing ones you can have the deepest experience? What is the point of giving a flower more scent if at the same time you deny the importance of experiencing the scent? Finally, what is the point of knowing without living? But I ask you, Hanios almost shouted, what is the point of living without knowing? Olaf understood what was happening to Hanios. With the utmost delicacy he said to him, what is happening to you is that you have never lived. If you had, you would know that knowing is only possible when one has previously lived. Hanios did not answer. He was looking at the emptiness. With a guttural voice and very softly, he said to Olaf, tell or to teach me how to live. Hanios looked at the roof of the hut. The crossbeams that supported the roof seemed to have been placed by someone for whom the order of things was of no importance. How can this happen to me? He thought. Everything was so clear and safe, and then 2 sessions with some children are enough. Hanios waved his hands as if painting semantic quotation marks in the air, for everything to fall apart. The most terrible thing is that nobody seems to be interested in teaching me. I've been waiting for many days, and he doesn't come. I would have reacted differently. In fact, I wanted to teach them. I wanted them to be happier. But they don't think about that. They are only interested in themselves. Hanios had not left the hut for 15 days. The food was brought by the children or the women. They always came to the door singing or laughing. They hoped that Hanios would notice, but he seemed to be somewhat obtuse of understanding. In the Council of Elders the case was discussed. Some began to doubt that Hanios understood, or on the other hand, was certain that sooner or later Hanios would begin to learn about himself. He said that someone who had so quickly perceived the children as possessing something different would have to come to see it in himself. Hanios was desperate. He felt that everything around him was hostile, and that he was to blame for it. He closed his eyes as if trying to push away the thought of running away. He knew that if he did, he would die. But it was impossible to stop thinking about running away, cutting some branches, building himself a raft, and throwing himself into the sea on it. Suddenly, he saw a lake, a full orange moon reflected on its surface. The night breeze caressed its dampness, and on its shores, small bushes and milk-colored straws moved placidly, as if enjoying the freshness of the wind and the smell of the water. The mountains surrounding the silvery surface seemed to shelter it from any accident. The water, the wind, the moon and the mountains were a single construction. They were all part of Hanios, and for the first time in his life he perceived them as such. Suddenly, a fluttering, a white heron flew over the transparent water. The movement of its wings was a symphony. Hanios began to sing a melody. He realized that it represented flight and was beautiful, and it also came from himself. The heron approached the surface of the lake. One wing brushed the water and created a series of fantastic ripples that crashed against each other. Hanios invented the melody of the heron in contact with the water. It was also beautiful, and represented his vision as if it were himself. The heron floated on the water. Its body moved with the waves. It circled or rose and fell with a smooth movement. The melody changed and became placid and joyful. The bird wished to dive into the liquid, took a breath, and disappeared under the water. The music became the coolness of contact. Hanios could change the image and the music at will. Everything came out with unmatched perfection, everything matched, and everything came from within him. Hanios opened his eyes. He understood the poet, the painter, and the musician. He knew that he had lived. That Olef was right, it was living that made him learn. He understood that it was only a matter of letting his inner self manifest itself freely, without thinking, without analyzing. This, he said to himself, is the only way to know something. It is necessary to let it be born first in order to understand it later. If it is not born and is not, there is no way to understand it, for there is no possible way to understand that which does not exist. Only what exists can be understood. Or opened the door, approached Hanios and looked him straight in the eyes. Hanios held his gaze and with a smile said to Or, "Thank you for not coming." Acopilco-Susevita. The meeting was planned for the evening at any time. The building was old, the staircase dark with a metal handrail. The apartment was on the second level. It smelled of incense and patchouli. The floor was wooden, books laid on the floor forming corridors around a center. Two thin mattresses were next to each other, and near them, a rocking chair and an armchair. Joanne's paintings all over the walls, a stiff hand covering an anguished face, a freshly hanged man with the limp rope around his neck, a body wrapped in bandages and lit by the red reflection of two candles, three women weeping at the body, a blue face on a blue background with a blue mask of his own death coming out of his face. A deep-eyed bearded man, his hair all bristling, a girl with gigantic eyes looking around with a frightened expression. "I like your paintings, Joanne, although I find them sad. The red reflection on the bandaged body is extraordinary." "But they are very badly painted," she replied. "I have yet to learn many techniques." "I think that technique is the least important thing. You create an atmosphere and convey what you want." "Yes, but for that you need to master it, otherwise it doesn't work. You can see something before your eyes and transfer it to paint, but if you don't handle the colors and the brush, what you paint is not your real vibe." Finya arrived, half asleep. "Fuck, I went to bed at 4 in the afternoon and could hardly wake up," she said. I asked them how they were. "Very well," they replied. "We like the way we live and we don't have the competition vibe." The music was on medium volume, Cat Stevens was magnificent, and the three of us settled down to listen to him. The Susevita monastery had just been plunged into dusk. The walls surrounding the cloister and the church were taking on a violet to orange coloration at that hour. The valley was filled with crickets chirping, and the wind moved the leaves of the trees that made up the pine forest surrounding the monks' cells. Bach was being played on the old church organ. All the monks had finished dinner and were ready to listen to the music. "The bad thing," Finya said, "is that when one starts to depend on an authority, one loses one's own decision-making ability and starts to act in molds and structures." "But that's very easy to avoid," said Joanne. "It's just a matter of being in a good mood, so that no one else's mood can affect you." "Yes, but that's only if you realize your dependence," I said. "The problem is that you often don't recognize it in yourself, although you do in others." Finya began to get excited. "It's very curious," she said, "how one can be in the same bad vibe as the other, and can see the others but not one's own." "It seemed," I said, "that man has a blocking mechanism that defends him from seeing himself, but allows him to see others." "That's true," said Joanne, "but it changes when you begin to realize it." Parich had invited Sulio and Andre to his cell. The three of them sat around the wooden table and began to savor the tea that Enrich had prepared for them. "Today I have thought a lot about the world around us," said Andre. "I think that the youth do not know what they want. Perhaps we are the only ones who can survive the degeneration that characterizes modern times." Don't think so, said Enrich. I think we are all searching, and that is a good sign. Yes, Celio answered. But the search must always be a confrontation and never an escape, and with today's youth only interested in getting high, spending their lives dreaming or achieving conquests and all that goes with that, the only thing that will be achieved is chaos. What I don't understand is how they don't realize it. It would seem that they are able to see what surrounds them and discard it, but they don't see themselves. You must remember, Enrich told him, that man possesses a mechanism that blocks his own knowledge, but allows him to detect problems with the people around him. Authority, I told them, is what often ruins us. We begin to depend on what they tell us, and we distrust our ability to find answers. It's true, Finya confirmed. I remember when I was in high school, I never missed a class. Many times I felt like going to the countryside to feel the fresh air and meditate on myself, but it was more important to go to the teacher talking about literature, or even the custom of meditation among Eastern peoples, than to do it with myself. Now that I remember, I can only think that I was very primitive. I'm glad you realize that, Joanne told her. In those days I used to tell you, but you didn't understand. I think, Joanne continued, that even today we have a tendency to depend on authority. For example, I know that the important thing when I paint is my inspiration, but I still have the idea of going to ask my painting teacher about the way to do things. Imagine, I said to them, if we, living the way we do, still have problems of authority, what will become of the people who belong to religious or military institutions? The tea was delicious and rich, Andre told him. It is perhaps because of the sensation of warmth I experienced while drinking it that I remembered that tomorrow we will have the meeting with the Honorable Director General of the Order. It is true, said Enrich. His Lordship always creates in all of us a feeling of human warmth. He has taught us practically everything we know. In such a person one can trust. His words are the essence and wisdom. I have often wondered, said Celio, to what extent his Lordship represents an authority that, by its very character, inhibits the creative capacity. I think that in his case, there is not this process which is so common to observe in the external world. A leader appears, and a whole people begin to follow him blindly, losing thereby their self-sufficiency, or an artist or a youthful figure appears, and the people begin to depend on his teachings and fall into dependence. But that does not happen with his Lordship. He is very careful not to provoke or create dependencies among the members of the order. The phenomenon of authority, said Enrich, is very interesting. Man tends to look for authorities that give him security. When he finds someone who represents the theoretical ideals, he falls under their aegis, and the worst thing is that he rarely realizes the fall and the dependence that is created when it occurs. Why the theme of death in your paintings, Joanne? I asked. It's because, she explained, it's the moment when you realize the road you've traveled because you reach the end of it. Before that, you don't know what's going to happen to you. We have the impression that there are roads that we travel, I said, but do they really exist? I think, Finya answered, they are more like circuits than roads. They get shorter and shorter until suddenly they disappear, and that's when you're in the good vibe. It's all about learning from life, from what you do, I said. You need to let go of what you have to realize that it exists, and you also need to get to know other realities, because that's how you realize your own. That is the beauty of the mota. I have learned a lot from it. I don't think, said Joanne, that it teaches you anything and you learn nothing by using it. It all depends on how you use it, I replied. If you think you're going to listen to beautiful music with it, and that's all you do, you don't learn. But if you turn everything off and start looking at it, you do learn. Besides, it's a matter of being with the right person. I have learned a lot. The other day I realized by feeling it that time does not exist. I saw something, and it was new. Then I saw something else, and it was also new. Everything was new. It only existed at the moment of seeing it because it was created in that instant that taught me that time does not exist. The last time, I realized that what I saw and heard were by themselves, that is to say, that the images had an existence, and that I was the one who constructed them. You are right, Finya admitted. We too have learned so much that cannot be said in words or gestures. It's that what you learn, added Joanne, is very difficult to convey. Its reality and subtlety is yours, and a word or phrase does not contain it. It is obvious that the state of mystical ecstasy, said Enrich, is not transmissible. I wish it were, then no one would fight or envy. It is true, Sulio confirmed. What one feels in those moments cannot even be translated into words. But if that is so, said André, how can we know that it exists in the other? And furthermore, how is it that it has a name and denomination if it cannot be transmitted? The fact that we call it mystical ecstasy, replied Enrich, is only a symbolization that allows us to communicate. Of course, it would be absurd to give a name to something that no one has ever felt the same way. The fact that it has a name does not indicate that it can be transmitted. It only means that it has coincided in several, and a name has been given to signify the coincidence. But then, how can we communicate, I said, if it is not possible to transmit what one learns? It is very simple, Joanne answered. We cannot communicate in the sense of transmitting experiences. The only thing we can hope for are coincidences of experiences. It's very interesting, said Finya, how with the mota you become sensitive and ideas begin to coincide in such a way that you can communicate. What happens in those moments, I pointed out, is that one is freed from seeing oneself, one becomes uninhibited, and what is in oneself comes out, without blockages, without considerations, without agreements. That is what allows us to communicate. Of course there are methods, said Enrich. Otherwise the monastery would have no reason to exist. Remember what happens when we pray in the cloister or in our cells. We forget impediments and considerations. We simply pray. We just pray, and that makes us free. It increases our sensitivity and we unite with the universe. Remember the teachings of His Lordship. It makes us feel in communion with man and with God, and that accelerates and allows us to have experiences like those associated with the so-called mystical ecstasy. Of course, said Sulio, it is not that they are transmitted, but only that we accelerate, in all of us, their occurrence, and that makes them begin to coincide. If you breathe very deep and very often and then put the smoke into your lungs, you get the best effect, said Joanne. That's true, Finya admitted, but that produces the most enormous dizziness in the world. The cigarette was nearly finished. I took one last drag and put it in the ashtray, stubbing it out. We had agreed not to play music and to leave the purple light on. Don't look so directly into the spotlight, Finya recommended. You can damage your eyesight. Joanne is beautiful, I thought. She has an intangible mystery. Her paintings, her rings and necklaces represent death. But this adoration is the simple but profound desire to know the way. It is the idea that everything is different from one moment to the next, and that only at the end can one know the reason and why everything happened as it did. Without realizing it, I began to speak out loud. Wanting to know what will happen only prevents that from happening. Believing that halfway through the journey one can know the reason for it is lacking. Only at the end is it possible to see everything, for the simple reason that then nothing new will happen. It is what I told you before, said Finya. We move simultaneously in many circles. Some are already solved and have disappeared, but others are in process. Do not confuse what is solved with what remains to be solved. The Director General of the Order went up to the pulpit and began to speak. Dear brothers, Today we will talk about the fact that we must be pure in order to know the essence of God. To be pure does not mean only to do good things, but more than anything else to be free of envy, evil, and cowardice. It implies a deep self-knowledge and the discarding of one's own personal history. Purity is only possible when one does not self-ferment evil, and when one's inner self is loved as much or more than one's outer self. How is it possible that sometimes we are unable to see all that is around us? Finya exclaimed. We buy a candle and leave it forgotten on a chair, never remembering to admire it or at least see it. We think there must be more important things than seeing it, or looking at a flower, a stone, or a tree. They tell us that we must be this or that we must excel or study, and they make us think that only if we do that will we be valuable. But if we look at a candle or a flower, we are nothing. That's what we start to do, and that's why we don't admire everything that exists around us. I sometimes am like that with my painting. I think that I must spend my life painting and that I have no right to do anything else, because that would waste my time. The truth of the matter, I said, is that you should wait for inspiration to come to you, and only then paint. To do it in a determined way, and with fear of wasting time on something else, is not good. I know that, Joanne replied, but how do you do that? It is necessary, I answered, that we are pure, that is to say, free, and that can only be achieved by thinking that what we feel is valuable. If we feel like resting, it is valuable. If we feel like seeing the stars, it is valuable. It is all a matter of trusting ourselves. The monks listened with concentrated attention. His lordship continued speaking. God is all around us. He is the method and the goal. But to reach Him, we must reach ourselves. If we do not do so, we will never understand. We must try to channel our efforts to this self-knowledge, for only in this way will we succeed with God's help in channeling the world. Our world is in full decadence and degeneration. The youth is only concerned with pleasure and does not care about trampling on all known values. Joanne had a bright, deep gaze. She leaned back on the mattress and began to speak. The ultimate pleasure is in self-knowledge. Nothing exists outside of that, and to achieve it, it is necessary to live. It is necessary to see it freely in what we do, and that only happens when you manifest what you are and accept to be as what you are, without concealment, without hypocrisy. Joanne, I interrupted, I really want to hug you. What did you say? She asked. I really want to hug you. And Rich was enthusiastic. His lordship's words made him very happy. He dared to ask a question. I would like the world to realize and accept love. I would like to leave Susevita and transmit this certainty, but I am very afraid to do so. What does that mean, Your Honor? It only means that your certainty is not such, that your knowledge is intellectual and logical, but not experiential. If it were, you would not be afraid. Finya and Joanne were astonished. Finya looked at me with pitying eyes and said, You got on my nerves. Why did you say what you said and didn't do it? If you feel like, in your own words, it's valuable, then why? I was afraid, Finya, I answered, afraid that it wouldn't match. And Rich was meditating in his cell. He felt very sad and distressed. His lordship is right, he thought. There is something missing. I understand it and I like it, but I am afraid. That only means that I am insecure, but how can I not be? How can I not be? I got up from my seat, walked over to Joanne and hugged her. It's a delicious feeling, I thought. Caressing her is like smelling a flower. And Rich got up from his chair, took his coat, and, after saying goodbye to her ladyship, went out into the world. Look what I found, Finya almost shouted. In this book there is a poem about me, written by Russ. You have the essence of the feline, you lick your wounds alone, so as not to fill yourself with evil. How I love Russ. It has incredible depth and also describes me as I am. It's true, said Joanne, that's you. Joanne, I said, you look sad. It's not sadness, she replied. It's the worry of not being able to transmit my waves. It's useless, you can't communicate them. I say my things in my own way, and sometimes people are so stupid that they don't understand them. But that doesn't mean I won't say them the way I want to say them. I don't have to change or make myself understood, he continued. It simply coincides or doesn't coincide, that's all. It's just that people, said Finya, don't want to understand. If they wanted to, everything would match. What happens, Joanne replied, is that some people have no dignity. It's so easy to see when someone doesn't have it. It's always pitiful and embarrassing to see someone like that. Let's listen to Stevens, she proposed. It's the depth and the beauty. Sure, Finya replied happily. It's the ultimate. You know, Finya, I'd like him to be with us. I don't know if it's because I want him to be or because he should be. I think, Finya replied, he'd be fine here. If you feel he should be, it's because it would be good for him to be. We'd really like it, said Joanne. If you could meet him, he's the cool one. He's probably at the shack in Acopilco, said Joanne. I heard there was going to be a blowout there. How about we go there? What's a blowout? I asked. I can't explain, said Finya. You have to live it. Come on, please, Joanne asked me. The road was delightful. The trees on the road were barely visible, and the car seemed to glide on clouds. The hut was nice. There was a small room with a fireplace, and the warmth was comforting. Finya and Joanne's friend was there, as if waiting for us. Hi, he said. How nice of you to come. We were thinking about you a lot, Joanne explained, and we wanted to share with you how we felt. I wanted to be with you too, he said. I was watching the fire and listening to the music, and I gave you very strong vibes. It's really cool of you to come. What's your name? I asked him. I'm Enrich, he answered, and you? The Zero. The visitor was awaited with a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Al-Harisi had ordered 2 lookouts to be on the lookout for any sign that Yani Jaba was approaching. On the 3rd day, one of the lookouts announced that he had spotted a column of smoke that seemed to be moving in the direction of the royal palace. Al-Harisi immediately sent for the director of the mathematical seminary of the kingdom and, locking himself in the royal chamber with him, explained the significance of the impending visit of the Yani Jaba. Yani Jaba's greatest satisfaction was traveling through the desert. The sand had taught him what men had been unable to, despite his eloquence and use of language. Twice he had been banished from Arabia, and twice he had been pardoned by the Caliph himself. It had been 5 years since anyone had bothered him, and lo and behold, Al-Harisi asked him to appear urgently at the royal palace. Nothing good, thought Yani Jaba, will come of this visit, but to refuse it would be tantamount to certain death. At the time of Caliph Tibraim, Yani Jaba was head of the mathematical seminary, and in that position he had developed a whole evolution in the conception of numerical interactions. It was precisely for this reason, and during that memorable session of the board of directors of the seminary, that it was decided to banish him for the first time from the kingdom. It was paradoxical how such a remarkable development in mathematical thought had met with such opposition, especially when at present that same conception was already accepted as obvious. The second banishment occurred that same morning of the 2nd month, when Yani Jaba was found in his bedchamber taking measurements of the caliph's favorite wife, to use as data to formulate the perfect geometrical relationship for a woman. It was considered unfairly, of course, disrespectful and humiliating to the royal family, and Yani Jaba thought it would now be the 3rd banishment. A line of thoroughbred Arabian horses came out with their respective riders to welcome Yani Jabba. At the entrance to the palace, the caliph's personal guard was ready to give the royal salute. When Yani Jabba arrived at the gates of the marble building, the caliph, on foot, came out to greet him. That night, the entire harem placed itself at the disposal of the ex-mathematician exile. At 8 o'clock in the morning, a special envoy from al-Harisi came to wake him up and serve him. At 10 o'clock, Yani Jabba savored a delicious breakfast, sitting by the crystal-clear fountain in the living room of the palace. At 12 o'clock, Yani Jabba was led to the royal apartments, where the caliph and the director of the mathematical seminary were waiting for him. They sat on cushions around a round table. The room received abundant sunlight, but the atmosphere was cool, for the ingenious architect of the palace had devised an excellent system of ventilation. Al-Harisi took a breath, and after sketching the best of his smiles, said thus to Yani Jabba: "I have called you for 3 reasons. The first is that I am very fond of you, and I have missed your presence. The second is because the development of the concept of numerical interaction has suffered a setback and is at a standstill. It so happens that you, its inventor, will have to get it out of the quagmire. The third reason is a dream I had that only you will be able to interpret. I dreamed that time measured with a clepsydra stopped, but I kept thinking. When I became aware of it, time began to march, and I was amazed at how little time had passed, and how many thoughts and ideas I had had in that time that did not pass. You will have to tell me the meaning of the dream, in addition to the other assignment." Yani Jabba rested in his room, saw a flower, and tried to understand the caliph's dream. It occurred to him that something similar to the dream could be happening to him. He was seeing the flower, and that vision had no time. Moreover, if the vision was divided into an infinite number of parts, each one would still be a flower. There would come a time when the number of divisions would be so great that the size of each would be very small, and yet the vision of the flower would not change. If the divisions continued, it would happen that each one would be a nullity, and yet the vision would remain the same. "I wanted to say then," rejoiced Yani Jabba, "that the nullity exists." Yani Jabba sent word to the caliph that he had found the solution to his dream, and at the same time had discovered that which would cause the conception of numerical interaction to develop further. At 12 o'clock sharp, Yani Jabba was transferred to the royal chamber. "The solution of your dream," said Yani Jabba to al-Harisi, "is very simple, and paradoxically it is the same solution that the conception of interactions needs. It is the acceptance of nothingness as reality. It is the invention of a new mathematics, that of the existing nullity. In order for you to understand, I will give you an example. Imagine a hollow sphere. The interior of it contains nothing. It is nullity, but that interior exists because it is part of the sphere. That is to say, it is the existence of nullity. To it we will give the name of zero." The observatory. On asteroid 105,925H, the observatory is built. As one approaches it, from the periphery one soon begins to recognize a white dot nestled in a dark mass. At a sufficient distance, one can begin to make out the dimensions of the gigantic building. A white sphere in the center of 4 arms built in the shape of cylinders. When one descends to the asteroid and, after verifying all the controls, descends to the ground, it is when one suffers the shock. It is a building that is too big, so big that you feel it is going to crush you. But when you enter one of the cylinders is when it stops impressing. Of course, the decor is very modern, but it is almost a home. As you approach the central sphere, you begin to notice a strange blue-violet glow. The moment you peek over the railing, Scarlatti's music begins to play, and as you turn to the center of the sphere, you see the world from which you came, and the world becomes big or small, and when it is big, it is there. And after seeing that without understanding it, one takes a few steps and finds another railing. Looking out there in the middle of the sphere is a whole galaxy, and other steps and another railing, and there is the whole universe. At that moment is when you decide. You throw yourself into the center of the sphere, and on the way, worlds and stars pass by, and all because you are going to the center of the sphere. In that instant, one becomes a universe. One sees oneself as separate from many others who live in other worlds. But at the same time, one realizes that one could be any of those beings, and that what really matters is the universe that one forges and builds. One discovers that each step can mean another universe, and that entering it only depends on a change in the point of reference, that of son, brother, husband, father, house, village, city, country, continent, world, solar system, constellation, galaxy, universe. At that moment, everything is embraced, because everything begins to be within oneself. The observatory is a gigantic building on the asteroid 105,925H. When you manage to penetrate it, you become one with the universe. Part 2. Comments on the internal construction of the world. Watch the fire burning in the hearth of your home. The burning logs have no light or heat in themselves. The movement of the flames and tongues of flame does not exist as such. It is you who constructs and perceives the heat, light, and movement of the fire. You are not the creator of the molecular and atomic interactions of that which you call fire, nor do you construct the chemical transformation, but the heat and light you feel are produced only within you and are your effect. You do not create the cells of the tree in your garden, but you do create the green of its leaves and the coolness of its shade. You do not build the electronic movement of the atoms of the water molecule, but you do build the coldness of its contact and its crystalline character. You are not responsible for the fermentation of the vinegar, but you are responsible for its bittersweet and aged taste. That which surrounds you undergoes two transformations in yourself when you perceive it. The first occurs when your nervous system transduces external energetic changes into electrical activity in the neurons of your brain. The electrical activity is the same, regardless of whether the external energy that causes it is movement of photons, pressure changes in the air, or increased electron shocks. The second transformation occurs when the electrical activity gives rise to a subjective experience of light, sound, or heat. Light, sound, or heat do not exist in objects. You are responsible for, and the sole creator of their existence and reality. From this point of view, the world as you perceive it is only a description. If our brain were constructed differently, the description would be different. If, for example, the visual pathway ended in the auditory cortex instead of the visual, and vice versa, we would see sounds and hear lights. That would be the world for us, and we would come to consider it as real and outside of us, as we now consider it seeing lights and hearing sounds. If we could become an insect, a bird, or a fish, we would realize that the transformations are different, and so are the descriptions. Realizing that the world is only a description does not imply discarding it, but simply accepting it as the product of a personal construction. Of feeling important. When we are children, adults see us as helpless, immature, and lacking in knowledge. They perceive us as beings that require a guide and a teacher. Because of this consideration, they feel entitled to teach us. First, they convince us that they and not we are the only ones who can decide and know. They instill in us the idea that we are incapable and ignorant, and that we require guidance and advice. Gradually, we assimilate this teaching and begin to need guidance and a teacher. The process is completed when we internalize the other, and their physical presence is no longer necessary. At that moment, it is the other in us who decides and who must be listened to. His teachings are followed to the letter, and the worst thing, we forget that it is the other in us who decides, and we rather think that we are the ones who decide. The internalization of the other is not only in terms of particular and concrete teachings, but above all, in the consideration that the other is always right and is always observing us. We become observers of ourselves through the internalization of the other as an observer. The one who is observed is not, in reality, oneself, but the other within us. To be a spectator of oneself is, in reality, to be observed by the teachings of the other. Our insecurity and our dependence arise from this internalization. Our lack of inner freedom has the same cause. The consequences of the process of internalization are dire. First of all, we learn to feel observant, judgmental, and evaluative. Since the other is always right in his judgments, and we ourselves are not, we try to conform to the expectations that the other has instilled in us, which leads to behaviors that try to adapt to and satisfy the hypothetical judgment and assessment of which we are the object. Secondly, we think that everyone around us is only interested in watching us. We think that we are very important, and that others have nothing else to do but to be watching us and judging us, which has an absurd and paradoxical consequence. Everyone thinks that he or she is being observed, and therefore conforms to that observation, when in reality we are all contemplating ourselves through the internalization of the other. The fact of adjusting to the supposed observation and judgment of the other, when in reality the other is engaged in seeing oneself, and not in observing us, creates a false and redundant situation where the only reason and motive of the relationship between oneself and the other is the maintenance of the teachings of the internalized other. Thirdly, it creates a continuous feeling of insecurity and struggle to keep ourselves in agreement with the internalized teachings. The instant we do something that does not correspond with the internalization or simply think it, we fall into conflict and despair. Fourth, we stop learning from ourselves because all we do is analyze our future and past behaviors in terms of whether they were or will be in accordance with the teachings, and rarely in terms of the behaviors themselves. Fifth, we stop learning from others because we only see them as observers of ourselves and never as separate entities. Sixth, we stop feeling, since any feeling that may not correspond to the internalized structure is rejected and blocked before it appears. Above all, we cease to be free because we consider that there is a prefixed and predetermined path to which we must adjust and to which we are committed. Of opposites. When we mention the existence of something, we create, at the same time, its non-existence. When we handle the concept of goodness, we simultaneously construct the concept of evil. When we are conscious of our experiences, we invent the absence of them. When we perceive life, we see death. When we discuss being and its essence, we talk about non-being and its correlations. When we are spectators of ourselves, we are the architects of not seeing ourselves. When we remember that we have memory, we construct amnesia. When we argue about wealth, we create poverty. When we feel old age, we remember youth. When we predict the future, we build the past. All our values and concepts as verbal constructs entail and result from their opposites. The concept of movement can only be handled and understood if the immobile is known. The consciousness of pleasure only exists when it arises from that of pain, which means that the opposites result from a single construction and appear simultaneously and inexorably the moment we categorize and analyze any experience. The simultaneous construction of the opposite is a verbal necessity, but it is not included in the pure experience. In other words, the experience itself, without analysis and evaluation, is unique and existent in itself. On the other hand, the verbalization of it is only comprehensible when it gives rise to and results from the comprehension of its opposite. This, which might seem a mere formal and academic analysis, is more real than a primary necessity. To demonstrate this, it suffices to recall that the concept of need would not exist if there had not previously been that of satiety. Of agreements. A physical object is considered real as long as several observers so agree. If the rose that someone observes is also seen by several, that someone has the certainty that it exists. It does not matter that the experience of the rose is different in the various observers. What matters is that all of them assign it the same name. In the same way, it is accepted that a fact is true as long as it is so considered by a culture, a society, a group, or at least more than one acceptor. This is what has been imposed on us as teaching, and its force is such that whoever manages to escape from it is considered sick. Our society assigns the highest value to situations of agreement. Such an assignment would not be very serious if it were only reduced to what we call the physical world. The seriousness of the matter is that it is not reduced to that world, but on the contrary, it is transferred to the inner world. If someone has a dream, that dream is considered unreal since there is only one observer. When someone has an idea or a thought, he feels the need to communicate it, not to transmit it, but to produce an agreement. If such agreement is not achieved, the idea or thought is invalidated. The parts of our inner experience that are not accepted by others cease to be accepted by ourselves. Their reality and value depend on the agreement we manage to establish. We are slaves of others, and this prevents us from being free. It is only when we begin to respect ourselves, that is, when we know that the reality of our inner experience does not need to be validated by agreements, that we begin to be free. The reality of an experience is contained in the experience itself, never in its acceptance, validation, or valuation by others. Someone might ask what happens when the valuation is done by oneself. The answer is unequivocal. Such valuation does not exist in us. It is always the result of others, in this case, of others introjected into us. Of inheritance. To play is to manifest something that is not directly related to what one feels. In playing, there is a separation between open behavior, that is, the reality that the other can share, and the internal reality. Humans are not the only ones who play. Lower animals also play. In a colony of cats in captivity, the dominant feline attacks the other members when, being very hungry, someone offers them food. The cause of the aggression is, in that case, quite different from the aggression itself. The animal wants the food. It does not want to attack, but it has learned that the only way to achieve its goal is to keep the other cats away from the food. This is nothing more than a game. The behavior that many animals use to defend their territory is not very different from that described above. The silverback gorilla has learned that its appearance is so impressive that it only needs to beat its chest or kick the ground while gesticulating to make any potential enemy move away from its territory. The desire to conserve territory is very different from the behavior to which it gives rise. In this particular case, the gorilla plays at being very aggressive because it has learned that this is the way it can ensure the subsistence of its colony. Again, the overt behavior is distanced and separated from its true raison d'etre. The gorilla is very peaceful. He almost never uses physical force to achieve his goals. It is enough for him to manifest the behavior that other animals interpret as aggression, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that his internal reality is contrary to this manifestation. Animal games are always related to a primary subsistence need. It is this need that drives and moves them to play. Between what the animal feels and what it acts, there is a series of mediating processes that form a bridge or connection between internal and external reality. The connection is established through a learning process, and is always the result of the desire for survival. Man has developed to the maximum his capacity to build mediatory bridges. It is a heritage that he has preserved intact, although in most cases it implies, and has as its raison d'etre, an internal insecurity that one wishes to diminish. The man who manifests love when in reality he feels hatred, or who acts as if he feels an emotion when in reality he has an affective nullity, plays these games for at least two reasons: A, to defend himself against his feeling of impotence and insecurity, and B, to avoid causing harm. The person who plays motivated by the first reason is characterized by his tendency to use people as objects. The person who plays motivated by the second reason is characterized by naivety. In both cases, however, a mediating connection has developed between what is felt and what is manifested. Man, like the lower animals, develops this connection as a result of previous learning, and thus learns to manifest something quite different from what he really feels. But unlike the animals, he is driven in his play by a series of theoretical considerations that are quite different from that which actually provokes them, and from that from which they result, and from which they result. Man is not the games he plays, and is therefore capable of realizing their existence, and above all, of discarding them. When he succeeds in doing so, he not only throws away his entire personal history, but also distances himself from his inheritance. This process provokes a change of state characterized by the passage from absolute determinism to self-determinism. The approach to self-determinism leaves free and uninhibited all the processes of representation, creativity, and inner freedom that the human brain is capable of mediating, which has the effect of bringing the human being closer to his essence. From internal experience. There are two reasons that drive someone to impose structures and establish agreements. The first comes from the desire to give more reality to an internal experience, getting someone to have the same internal experience through a process that involves making them agree to accept an agreement and incorporate a structure, makes them feel that, for this reason, it acquires a quasi-physical reality. This process is a simple transfer of learning that consists of considering a physical fact as real if, and only if, several observers agree that it is. The second reason is the desire to share an internal experience. What a subject feels, the states of serenity, anguish, depression, love, etc., have a character of such intensity in terms of their existence and reality that it is difficult to think that the person or persons with whom one establishes a relationship do not have the same phenomenological experiences. To know if they really have them is always a difficult question to answer. It is precisely this difficulty what drives to take measures tending to force other people to incorporate this type of experiences. The idea that an experience can be transmitted through the use of pressure procedures is definitely absurd. The only thing that is achieved in most of these cases is an external manifestation that indicates that the experience has been had, without actually having succeeded in transmitting it. Only in some cases do impositive techniques succeed in changing the internal experience. Techniques commonly known as brainwashing can achieve this. However, the result in other areas is disastrous for the subject. Commonly, the person who wishes to impose an internal experience is satisfied when the person on whom it is imposed manifests external signs that indicate success in the imposition, which is very contradictory and absurd, since the only thing that is achieved is a manifestation that is nothing more than a deception, and not the internal experience that was intended to be transmitted, and yet this satisfies the imposer. This indicates that the desire to share an internal experience is just another game. Sharing it or not sharing it may or may not occur, but it is never the result of exerting pressure. of the duration of the changes. We are accustomed to think that a change in a person takes a long time to take place, that it is always partial and only related to some restricted area of the so-called personality. Nothing could be more false. The process of change is completely separate and alien to the temporal dimension. Change only occurs when it is happening, and that happening is always in the now. Therefore, it neither lasts long nor lasts short. It simply does not recognize time. When someone discovers a new dimension is when he changes. The discovery occurs in an instant. Before that moment, there was no change, therefore that change does not exist but only in the instant in which it occurs. To think that what happened before that instant is part of the change is to accept that nullity exists. In a certain science fiction story, it is told about a great inventor who discovers the time machine after having committed a murder. It occurs to him that the best way to avoid the punishment of justice is to go back in time. In doing so, he lives his whole life over again until the moment he commits the murder and invents the time machine. Again, it occurs to him that his salvation is to go back in time. In doing so, he lives his life again until he commits the murder, invents the time machine, and goes back to the past. This whole circle continues to infinity and for all time. The situation that precedes the change is similar to this infinite circle, that is to say, to nothingness. Therefore, it does not exist. When change occurs, it is neither partial nor restricted. Rather, it is a total and absolute renewal where everything is modified and nothing of the previous remains. Perhaps that is why it is so difficult to change. There is an intense desire for everything to remain the same. There is a fear of modification because it is known that it will be total. The person who changes travels through a gradient in which the first modifications occur in short intervals and are relatively simple. Afterwards, the changes become more spaced out and increasingly profound and total. There comes a time when change can only mean total and absolute renewal. Of enemies. Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan affirms that man, in order to be free, must overcome 4 enemies: fear, power, age, and clarity. The reason for the first 3 is relatively easy to understand. The man who is afraid of discarding agreements, who depends on the power structure or feels old, is not free. Only when he overcomes these 3 enemies, he begins to be free. The enemy, clarity, is more difficult to understand. With this term, Don Juan refers to those situations in which one relies on a logical theoretical structure, or a series of preconceived ideas to explain the universe. Seeing things through a structure produces the sensation that everything is explainable and transparent, that everything is clear and easy. The only thing that this type of clarity leads to is redundancy and a failure to learn, which is why it is an enemy that threatens inner freedom. Clarity can be overcome only when someone realizes that the only valid learning is the one that teaches that what can be learned has no limits, and that, therefore, apparent clarity is only a prelude to new discoveries. From learning. How can we explain that someone simultaneously manifests behaviors associated with dependence and submission, and on the other hand with force and authoritarianism? The only way is to think that the people who taught these games manifested the same dualities. The young child sees someone authoritarian, and also sees someone who submits to that authority. He learns dependence and submission from those who submit to the authoritarian, while he learns strength and power directly from the authoritarian. This learning, together with the fact that at the beginning of ontogenetic development we learn by imitating, means that the 2 tendencies are engraved in the person in formation. The authoritarian behavior is used for the same situations in which it was seen to be used. The submissive behavior is applied and arises in the same situations that were associated with the submission of the other. It is only when we can reconstruct these experiences and understand them that we begin to overcome them. From the children. The authentic desire to have a child only arises when we are able to overcome the feeling and experience of insecurity, and therefore, when we are able to begin to give and receive. The parent-child or mother-child relationship is only productive when both members are able to learn from each other. This occurs at the moment when the structure of being a parent is discarded, leaving only what is essential and proper. A child should never be an object of use nor a satisfier of needs. It is a sibling and companion who teaches and learns, and is, therefore, worthy of greater respect and admiration. The desire to make the child the same as the parent is only an escape from one's own insecurity. It is the desire to establish an agreement and to establish a structure. Whoever is not capable of learning from a child should not have children. From learning. The only one guilty of not being able to learn is he who never learns what he teaches. The world is so wide and wonderful that not seeing it is always the result of blindness. Anything can teach. Raising one's head and seeing a mirror reflecting sunlight can be an automatic act, or it can give rise to infinite learning. That motor act can reveal all the physiological structure of muscular activity, all the laws of optics, and the existence of the sun and its reactions. It can give rise to the ultimate perceptual experience and to a whole phenomenological philosophy. Unfortunately, almost always raising the head is nothing more than moving the neck. Whether it is the latter or the former does not depend on the movement itself, but rather on the freedom to understand it. This indicates that any event can become the ultimate learning, depending on the learner's desire to do so. From the introjection of others. Being a spectator of oneself has as its reason and foundation the desire and need to be seen by others. In fact, to see oneself and to value what one does, says or feels, is always to see oneself through others. A real experience is never accompanied by observing oneself. The one who lives is oneself, and therefore there can be no self-valuation. If this appears, the experience ceases to be an experience and becomes a simple, redundant and circular structure, which results in not feeling. That is why events in which one has been a self-viewer are hardly remembered. Only real experiences are consolidated as memories. Remembering that one has been a spectator of oneself has no character, specificity or reality, and therefore cannot be revisited. On the other hand, the experiential experience has such force and knowledge that it is always remembered as such. From memory. Our brain is a mechanism that has an infinite capacity to store information. It is very likely that all our experiential experiences exist within us as memories. When we evoke a stored information, it appears as a new experience extracted and located in the store of memories. The fact that we do not evoke it does not mean that it does not exist. It always remains active and influencing our experience. The experiences and events stored in memory are not boxed and isolated from each other, but influence each other and remain active. Mutual influence and activity must run through logical channels and encodings. It is precisely this logic of mutual influences that makes one person appear different from the other. From fear. Each of us has to our credit such a large number of experiences that they should be sufficient to enable us to understand the universe. However, the case of someone who manages to reach such a level of understanding is exceptional. The only reason why understanding the universe is so exceptionally rare is that the experiences we have had are self-invalidating. Invalidation always implies not trusting in the validity and reality of one's own experiences, but, on the contrary, thinking that only those of others are valuable and authentic. The fears that one feels are nothing other than the fears of others. It is very easy to understand. The fear that is experienced is never authentic. It comes from not understanding a situation, from not trusting in the ability to understand it. And this distrust is the effect of the inability to give value to one's own experience of reality as an internal experience. The only reality we know is our inner experience. Something exists for us only when we are able to experience it. The existences of a physical world and of an internal one converge and become one when we feel them. The physical world and the inner world can only be differentiated by their character as trigger stimuli that trigger an inner process. The physical tree is different from the one that appears in our dreams, in terms of the former activating our internal processes through the triggering of our sensory pathways, and the latter activating those same processes through central brain stimulation. Activation through a sensory pathway or topical activation is the only real difference between the physical world and the imaginary one. The internal process resulting from the two types of activation is always the same and determines and constitutes reality. When someone flies, the reality of his flight is not given to him by his being able to get off the ground, but by the experience and sensation of doing so. So can dream that he flies, and Zutano can get on a plane and fall asleep. No one will see Fulano fly, and everyone will see that Zutano does. Fulano's reality and Zutano's reality are contrary to that of the observers. Fulano will feel that he flies. On the other hand, Zutano will not. Since the observers only see Zutano flying, as a result of the internal experience of seeing him fly, and since it is precisely that experience that is the only reality for the observers, it is also the only reality for Fulano and Zutano. In other words, the only one who actually flies is Fulano, since his internal experience is to fly. Zutano does not fly since he has no corresponding experience. The only one for whom Zutano flies is for the observers, since that is his internal experience. If someone asks on what flight depends and on what reality depends, the honest answer is only one: on internal experience. Such a statement could lead one to think that if we all accepted as the only reality that which is experienced, the world would become a schizoid chaos, since agreements would cease to exist. The truth of the matter is that chaos is what we are experiencing when we accept something as real, just because several observers consider it so. It is only when that consideration is capable of being lived as our own experience that we should accept it, since admitting it before living it only brings as a consequence that we cannot understand it. The crisis and ineffectiveness of almost all contemporary procedures of teaching and transmission of knowledge arise from not understanding that this knowledge cannot be transmitted by intellectual authority, but only as a real experience. Accepting a knowledge without experiencing it, but only because several authorities agree that it exists, has the most dire consequences. The acceptor becomes a simple repeater of knowledge, in fact identical to his teachers, and like them, he will transmit information by authority and by agreement, for it is the only thing he has learned, otherwise he would not do it. The acceptor of knowledge by authority is never sure of anything, and above all, does not trust himself. If someone tells him that what he intends to do is dangerous, he will give in to the suggestion, even though it is not true. He will not use his experiences, since before doing so, he will invalidate them by asking for advice, and he will become an automated robot that will always be an effect and never a cause. In fact, he will never be able to understand the universe, because he will not understand himself. From the images. An image is intangible as much as an experience or a dream. Its duration is as long as its existence, and this only occurs in the instant in which it is held. The image is a product of brain activity, but in itself has no physical counterpart. An image is a representation of the universe which, however, is remote from it insofar as it does not itself possess any tangible or measurable attributes. True, it may give rise to physical changes, and manifest and correlate with some motion, object, or texture, but it is none of these things. It is neither abstract nor physical. It is simply real. Its reality is such that it cannot be denied. Perhaps someday we will know how many neurons are necessary to give rise to an image, and we will know what activations of brain patterns are involved in making it appear. However, such knowledge will not be sufficient to explain its existence. When we have an image, we do not feel the cellular activation that originates it, nor do we observe the electrophysiology responsible for its appearance. We only have the reality and certainty of its existence as an image. The world we perceive has, as a perception, the same characteristics as the image we represent to ourselves. The flower we see is the result of brain activation, but this is not enough to explain and understand it. Let us suppose that we manage to build a machine with as many elements and connections as the human brain, and that it also functions in the same way as the human brain. The machine will have images and will be able to make internal representations, which will appear as a result of the gestalt activity of all the elements that constitute the automaton. They will arise as an effect of the mechanical or electrical activity of its elements, but they will be more than that activity and cannot be fully explained as a result of it, since they will possess very different characteristics. The image and representations of the robot will have neither mass nor weight, nor will they occupy any space, even though they arise from elements that do. In the same way, our images are paraphysical, even though they result from the functioning of physical elements. How can we understand the appearance of a new property, that being so far removed from physics, arises from physical elements? Nobody knows. Of logic. The best way to understand is to become that which one wants to know. Only at that moment, knowledge becomes part of the being, since it is felt as one's own experience. We will never be able to penetrate a mystery if we do not live it. In the same way, we will never be able to know of the existence of the conceptual universe of the one with whom we relate, if we are unable to become that one. Our laughter, our joy or our frustration may be the same or different internal experience of so-and-so. The only way to know is to be so-and-so. If we could do that, we would realize that our contemporary's inner experience is different from ours, and in the same way that ours is different from moment to moment. But at the same time, we would know that there is something common and unifying in the different. The adolescent knows this, and that is why he has a great tendency to live and become different characters. The performance of roles at this stage is nothing more than the desire to live different realities, since only in this way is it possible to understand them in depth. Faced with the great difficulty of becoming the subjects or objects we want to know, we choose to turn them into numbers, marks or symbols that we can handle and relate to each other. This is nothing more than the foundation of logic. We believe that a logical handling of symbolisms will allow us to have a deep knowledge of the objects or subjects that have been represented by them. Let us not deceive ourselves, we are only playing. The proof of this is that our logical reasoning accepts, without any resentment, relations of absolute identity, when in reality they are an absurdity and a falsehood. Identity relations never exist as realities in our internal experience. They only exist as such when symbols are exchanged in absolute form, as a result of the false thinking that considers it possible to establish rules of identity. That is why the logic that handles identities is aberrant. Absolute identity between two things does not exist either in our internal experience or in the physical universe. Even the chemical structure of two apparently identical compounds is different simply because they occupy different spatial locations. Mathematics, as a logical structure, exists in itself, but it never represents reality, since, like logic, it is based on identity relations. The person who uses logical procedures to arrive at knowledge is deceiving himself, since all he achieves is a logical management, not a real experience of the subject of knowledge. In the same way that absolute identity only exists and is handled in logical processing, absolute differences are nothing more than a structure that is considered real because no one has taught otherwise. It seems contradictory to maintain that absolute identity has as much non-existence as absolute difference. However, it is not. It is as false to say that the joy of Zutano is identical with that of Fulano as to say that they are different. They simply are in themselves, and therefore do not require or validate themselves through comparison. Good and bad, black and white do not exist as differences. Indeed, they do not even exist as authentic experiences, for the simple reason that they implicitly entail the need for the opposite in order to be real. An experience is neither white nor good, it simply is, and as such has a separate, unique and instantaneous existence. This leads us hand in hand to the consideration that the only thing that exists is while it exists. The feeling of serenity that someone may experience in this moment only exists in the now and in the instant it is felt. To think that yesterday it was felt, or that tomorrow it will be felt without feeling it, is to depend on the logical structure that considers time as real. It is to forget that even thinking about tomorrow or yesterday only occurs in the now, and that the sensation that is not felt does not exist. To think that one is not happy in the present, and to wish that in the future one will be happy, is the most absolute aberration. It means that one denies the present experience, and makes it falsely depend on a situation that does not exist. If in the future one will be happy, that will only happen at that moment, but it does not happen now, and that is the only important thing. Reasoning logically about a future event, trying to know it through reasoning, represents only a false substitution for our inability to live in the present. It is trying to know what will be felt without feeling it. It is to structure and define a path, forgetting that in doing so we destroy any possibility of learning. When we logically analyze an event of probable occurrence, and therefore anticipate the internal event that will trigger such event, we invalidate ourselves. Only by understanding that reality is an internal construction, and that it exists only at the moment it occurs, will we be able to learn and live. Judgments. To judge someone is to underestimate him, is to think that what determines his behavior and his reality is simple and mediocre. When we say that someone is making a mistake, or when we consider someone as stupid, simple, bad, or any other quantum and unitary category, the only thing we do is to demonstrate our incapacity to penetrate into the experience of the person we are judging. If we could do so, we would realize that things are neither simple nor easy, that the other's reasons are as or more complex than our own, and above all, that they are determined by a whole history and a series of reference points. Judging is very easy and comfortable, and also always has a narcissistic and self-indulgent component. What we do when we judge is to become an absolute and faultless point of reference. At least that is what we think. It is to feel that we are the deciders and determiners of realities. The truth of the matter is that, when we judge, we are nothing more than a grass blown by the wind. The problem is that at that moment, that grass thinks it is an oak tree and acts like one. To judge someone is to consider oneself incapable of falling into error, and always arises from ignorance and ignorance of ourselves. Of the man of science. Science can be teaching and learning only when it provides information that is not possible to obtain through internal analysis. The certainty in a knowledge obtained from self-analysis is enough to not need experimental replication. When, in spite of the certainty, the man of science goes to the laboratory, the only thing that drives him is the apparent desire to share and transmit that certainty. However, it is a deception, for the simple reason that it will not be possible to achieve certainty in the other through the objective communication of information. When the man of science devotes himself to trying to prove to other observers what is obvious to himself, science ceases to teach him and becomes just another game. This does not mean that scientific knowledge is invalid. It only means that it is not sufficient by itself, and that it loses all meaning when it becomes an activity of knowledge replication. The man of science should be happy, since the information obtained by him through his work is, more than anything else, knowledge about himself. If he is unhappy, it means that his work is only a deception and a prostitution of himself. The man of science should be free and detached from all structure. When, on the other hand, he is rigid and a slave, it only means that science is not the result of himself, but that on the contrary, he has become the result and effect of science, of certainty. Of certainty. There are those who think that their certainty as to the explanation and knowledge of one phenomenon is deeper, clearer, and more mature than the certainty of another. This idea gives rise to the appearance of impositional manifestations concerning reality. In other words, the person who thinks that his certainty is the only valid one feels the right to force another to accept it without thinking that perhaps the other has different reality and inner experience. While it is true that knowledge is not the data that is handled, but rather the experiential certainty, it is also true that the latter may not be shareable. The reason for this does not lie in the fact that certainty is relativistic, but only in the existence of different certainties. We all reach the same inner knowledge because it is not relative in its truth, but there are different gradients and rhythms for reaching it. Some people go very slowly, others walk faster. To transmit a certainty from an advanced level to a delayed one makes no sense and has no possibility. Doing so, despite the above, has three consequences: confusion, hostility, and misunderstanding. It is necessary to wait until the other reaches the same level as oneself, because at that moment the certainty will belong to both. When someone tries to impose the acceptance of certainties, he shows that he has not understood or realized that there are different gradients and different speeds to arrive, and furthermore, that his certainty is false. When someone feels annoyed in a disagreement, it shows that he has forgotten that it arises from a difference of levels and not from the existence of different truths. Truth is unique. To think otherwise is to give too much importance to the apparent existence of differences between entities. Every human being is surrounded by a multitude of structures formed during the process of socialization. The differences depend on the number of existing structures and the amount of them already discarded, never on the existence of a basic difference. Doubts. It is absolutely impossible to doubt oneself when one is oneself. One only doubts when one is the effect of other people's considerations. When the knowledge that someone transmits is absorbed automatically and is handled in this way, the receiver of such knowledge can easily fall into doubts regarding its value, reliability, or certainty. When, on the other hand, the knowledge comes from oneself and is the result of an inner experience, there is never any doubt about its reality. However, internal experience is not enough to stop doubting. it is indispensable that it not be self-invalidating. Self-invalidation is the introjection of the doubts of others. It is the acceptance of these doubts as real and the forgetting of their origin. If we could at least remember that the doubts manifested by the other are also the result of the introjection that this other has made of the doubts of another, and this, in turn, of those of another other, and this of those of another other, etc., we would never doubt. Of knowing. Some people think that theoretical knowledge differs from knowledge obtained through the physical handling of an object. In truth, there may or may not be a difference between the two. The difference is not in the knowledge itself, but in who knows it. It is possible that through direct handling of a physical object, it is possible to gain a better understanding of its characteristics. But it is also possible that such handling teaches absolutely nothing, while abstraction about the same object does. When the learner learns based on the considerations and opinions of those around him, and not on his own, real knowledge is no longer possible. On the other hand, when the learner decides this learning, knowledge begins to acquire reality. In the latter case, the approach may be theoretical, experimental, or of any other kind, and this does not mean that one will learn more or less, or that there will be any difference. It all depends on the approach and the motive of the learner and not on what is learned. Of the levels. The same event, especially when it is related to internal experiences, can be explained on many levels. For example, the feeling of anguish. Someone might say that their distress is because they feel judged by everyone. While this may be true, it is only a very superficial level of explanation, since the feeling of judgment only comes from considering what one is doing or feeling to be inadequate or wrong. But this, in turn, represents only a second level of explanation, because feeling that what one does is inadequate or wrong, in turn, results from feeling insecure. Moreover, feeling insecure derives from the idea that one's own feelings are worthless. This invalidation, in turn, results from considering internal reality to be less important than external reality. This, in turn, depends on the establishment in the past of an agreement and the structure that arises from it. Thus, distress arises from the fear of discarding the structure and the agreement. This fear is due to the idea that discarding the structure will lead to a situation of internal emptiness. The perspective of inner emptiness stems, in turn, from the idea that the interior does not exist. If we were to do the same type of analysis on many of our negative internal states, such as those related to feelings of fear, dependency, loss of control, frustration, etc., we would realize that they are all ultimately based on the idea that the internal does not exist or does not matter. Since the feeling of non-existence arises from a whole history, it could be said that every negative internal state contains, in itself, the whole history of a person. It is perhaps for this reason that discarding the whole personal history results in the disappearance of all unpleasant experiences. Of feeling and dependence. There are two kinds of people: those who feel and those who play at feeling. Those who feel are capable of giving themselves without thinking that doing so may imply any situation of dependence. On the other hand, those who play at feeling cannot give themselves to anything, since that makes them think of dependence and lack of freedom. To understand the absurdity, it is enough to analyze for a moment the fact that people who feel have learned to be free and independent in order to feel, while those who play only depend on the structure of the game. The one who feels is not afraid of being dependent because he is free. On the other hand, the one who plays is terrified by the prospect of dependence, since he is in fact dependent on his games. Those who are capable of surrendering have learned that doing so does not mean losing part of themselves, but on the contrary, implies getting closer to their essence. Those who are not capable of doing so are those who have learned to worry about remaining intact, as if they were a gift-wrapped jigsaw puzzle that, when losing one of its pieces, ceases to function. We are not a set of pieces, nor are we wrapped in tissue paper. We are unique and unitary entities that do not rust or lose pieces upon delivery. To surrender means to consider the act of loving without schedules, restrictions, or structures as the most important thing. It is to consider it an act of creation that cannot be substituted or compared to any other. Communication. How can you make someone understand what love, anguish, fear, or ecstasy are if they have never experienced them? It is impossible. This means that you cannot transmit an inner experience to someone who has not lived it. To achieve a transmission of inner experiences is nothing more than to reconfirm or reconstruct them in the person who receives them. Communication between two people depends on the degree of possible reconstructions. Communication is total when the coincidence of internal experiences is maximum. Communication is null when the experiences of one person do not coincide with those of the other. Communication is finished when, in some way, what one of the two people communicating is not understood by the other. In other words, when the ability to have cognition is blocked or does not exist. Of certainty and change. It is only possible to achieve real change when one is able to achieve a state of certainty. Self-knowledge is a game when it is based on data. Only at the moment when certainty appears, self-knowledge becomes real. Data can be transmitted. Certainty cannot be transmitted as such. This is explained by the fact that the only possible certainty is that which results from an internal experience, and this has no possibility of being transferred directly from one person to another. There is a dichotomy between data and certainty. When someone is not certain, has no certainty, he needs data. It follows that when someone is certain, he no longer needs data. All types of psychological therapies should tend to achieve certainty and not data in the patient. In fact, all of them try to transmit internal experiences and therefore certainties. But as it is not possible to achieve this directly, what they do is to try to create the conditions in which these certainties appear. The therapist must be detached from any theory in order to achieve the conditions in which certainties are communicated. When the therapist relies on a theory and not on his own certainty, he demonstrates that the latter does not exist in itself, and therefore there will be no way he can achieve it in the patient. This is because, if someone does not know something, he cannot elicit it in another. The need to conform to a theory is the need for data knowledge, and having such a need only means that the level of certainty has not been reached. From all the above arises the certainty that real knowledge is formed by certainties and not by data. In the same way, real change in a person only results from another change in his inner reality. This change can be achieved only when the level of certainty is reached. From interactions. The emergence of new knowledge is a direct result of the ability to establish interactions. When someone studies a particular event and is not able to find its interactions and relationships with others, his degree of knowledge is superficial and redundant. It is only when knowledge of an event is part of a mosaic of interactions that the event becomes known. The ability to establish and understand a body of interactions is what is commonly referred to as integrative capacity. The person capable of integrating dispersed information is the one who truly understands it. The moment an integration of information is achieved, new knowledge emerges. Since integration results in the appearance of new laws of interaction, it is not possible to glimpse these by the knowledge of an isolated event, since they are not included in such knowledge. It is only by relating that the laws of relations emerge. As these were not there before, their appearance is also that of a new knowledge. Of expectancy. The expectancy of an existence has as its only existence the expectancy itself. Of teaching and learning. When two people establish a relationship, and one of them feels that he can teach something to the other, he will never succeed if he sees himself doing it. One teaches only when teaching ceases to matter, when one is oneself, without limits, without censure, without self-complacency. Whoever learns, learns from what he sees. If he observes that someone has as a motive to teach him, he will learn to recognize that motive, and to act in correspondence and consonance with it, nothing more. If, on the other hand, he observes someone being, without motives or plans, he will learn everything that exists behind the plans and motives, that is to say, he will learn from being. His learning will come to him and teach him, he will neither go to learning nor to teaching. Since someone who is everything, that is what will be taught, and that is what will be learned. To meet a person who is not trying to teach is the most wonderful experience there is. That is when you really learn. From serenity. I know someone who only lives in one world. Anything that happens in that world affects him and makes him doubt himself. If someone in that world has a problem, everything becomes a problem, even himself. If an accident happens, everything becomes an accident, even himself. If someone has a pain, everything becomes pain, even himself. I wish he will come out of that world and meet many others. Only then he will stop becoming a problem, accident or pain. Only then will he know that there are more realities. Only then will he stop fearing. That person is locked up. Her imprisonment is because she is imprisoned. She will cease to be a prisoner when she leaves that world. In his confinement he only knows the four walls of his prison. He himself is the four walls. When he knows other worlds, the barriers will fall. He will understand that they can disappear at will. He will know that he is far more valuable than any boundaries. At that moment, he will begin to understand, and when he does, he will achieve serenity. He will know that being affected by a problem of one world results from not knowing others. You will stop thinking that you know everything that exists. He will stop feeling so important, and that will set him free. From the thresholds. There are people who have a great difficulty to feel emotions, to live experiences, to learn about themselves, or to surrender. There are others who have a great capacity to want without censorship or inhibitions, to surrender or to feel. We say of the former that their reaction threshold is very high, of the latter that it is relatively low. People with a high threshold exercise continuous controls over themselves. Those with a low threshold do not require controls, they simply trust in themselves. The magnitude of controls and thresholds is given and depends on the degree of socialization. If one has learned to adjust and adapt, that is, if the degree of socialization is high, so will be the inhibition and control, and therefore, the reaction threshold. If, on the other hand, the degree of adjustment is low, the threshold will also be low. This means that people who are incapable of feeling are those who attach the greatest importance to control, and that sensitive people, on the other hand, consider it unnecessary and absurd. The connection between the degree of socialization and the reaction threshold is clear to understand if one is able to understand the meaning and characteristics of socialization. When we speak of it, we refer to the process by which a subject is taught to adapt and adjust to the desires and needs of the people around him. Adjustment has as a direct consequence the introjection of others, and this in turn arms within oneself a system of self-censorship and self-judgment. Self-censorship and self-judgment are a blockage that inhibits everything it touches. It is this inhibition that alters the thresholds. The alteration always goes in the direction of increasing them and thus decreases sensitivity. of living and understanding. The whole beginning of our history is pure experience. The child lives without questioning or analyzing the consequences or causes of his experiences. If asked why he lives, he answers that he lives for life. It is only when he grows up that he begins to analyze. If the analysis is pure and without prejudice, he can come to understand what he lived before. The adult who is grown up being undergoes a similar process, that is to say, first he lives and then he understands his experience, which means that understanding has no limits, since the number of experiences has no limits either. If, on the other hand, the adult has grown up as a spectator of himself, he will tend to try to understand before living. If this is the case, both his experiences and his learning will have a limit. From the emergent properties. Internal experience is always an emergent property. This is because a pain, an emotion, the image of a flower, or even the perceptual vision of it are not contained or explainable per se in the activity of a set of neurons. When pain occurs, there is neuronal activity concomitant with the sensation. However, the activity of neurons does not contain the pain itself. Similarly, the physical presentation of an illuminated object results in the appearance of an image of the object. The image arises as a result of the activation of a neuronal population, specifically of the cells that make up the visual system. However, the image is not contained in the activation of neurons either. There is a missing link between neuronal activation and internal experience. The only way to understand this link is to suppose that the activation of a set or conglomerate of elements brings as a consequence the appearance of a property that does not exist and is not predictable on the basis of the unitary activation of these elements. The emergent property is the result of the interactions of the elements. This implies a Gestalt process in which the laws of the conglomerate emerge as a result of an organization. Since the interactions have neither mass nor weight nor atomic or molecular constitution, what results from them possesses these characteristics. To put it in other words, the internal image of an object, the sensation of pain or emotion, are not physical. This does not mean that correlations with physical changes cannot be found. It simply implies that by themselves they are not. The existence of a correlation is often confused with the essence of a phenomenon. When we experience a visual image, it is possible to register electroencephalographic or other changes during its occurrence. The electroencephalographic change is physical, but it is not the image, it only correlates with it. The image itself has no physical character. It is in itself different from the correlations that may be found with other phenomena. All of the above indicates that the internal experience is a property that emerges as a result of the interactions between the elements that are part of a complex organization. This emergent property, being a new result of an organization of interactions, does not possess a physical character, even though it arises from a set of physical elements. The problem of interaction is as real as the elements from which it arises. However, the result of this interaction is always something different from the interacting elements or units. Possibly all our inner experiences are that new product that results from an interaction, or even more so, the interaction itself. The same situation occurs in a relationship between two people. The relationship, when it is not based on structure or agreement, is an act of creation, and it results in something that is not contained by itself in each of the participants. The highest degree of relationship occurs when, as a result of interaction, love is created. Gorastes's phrase, "with him, with me, with the three of us," represents the poetic vision of the above. Of time. We believe that we live time simply because we see movement. The movement we observe we perceive as continuous, and in a sense, it is the illusion of continuity that deceives us. Our sensory systems have the characteristic of filling discontinuous spaces. The motion of an object is always made up of quantum steps, each of which is, in itself, independent of the one that follows and precedes it. If our perceptual equipment were constructed in such a way as to allow us to see the quantum steps, we would have no need to resort to the concept of time. We would realize that each quantum instant is unique and independent, and that its existence is only when it is and therefore timeless. In the case of our muscular movements, the situation is even more obvious. The movement of a hand or an arm is only an appearance of continuity. In reality, it is made up of a sum of elementary muscular contractions, each of which is in turn regulated by discrete impulses. In the same way, our sensations are quantum. Each instant is unique and exists only as long as it is experienced. The idea of past or future also exists while it is being lived. If I remember what I did without doing it, the memory exists only in this moment. If I think of what will happen, the thought occurs now, and that is its only existence. Time, therefore, is just another structure. It does not exist in itself, but only as an appearance associated with the illusion of movement. From waiting. People who are desperate seekers are those who can most easily fall into situations of dependence. It is enough for them to find someone who has found the way for them to want to learn what he has to teach them. They think that this teaching is so valuable that nothing can match it. They are capable of giving everything, and at no time do they hesitate to give themselves, and everything, in order to find what they so intensely seek. They begin to expect the one who knows to teach them, and wish that the almost sacred sensation they experience is mutual. If one of the two has understood that all waiting is absurd, since the paths are unique and individual, he will try to show it to the other. If the other is intelligent enough, he will understand instantly. If he is not, he will fall into despair until he understands that the solution lies only in himself. Del Camino. We are certain that there are paths that, when traveled, will lead us to being. We think this way because it is what we have been taught, never by our own discovery. We stumble and we zigzag, we walk along a path and we go round and round, always hoping to find it. It is the most laborious and difficult thing, since we do not know what we will find. Sometimes we think we are close, and sometimes we almost touch it. It is only when we discover that the path does not exist, that it is a fantasy, that we stop looking and start being. At that moment we begin to learn. From letting go. When we act thinking about how we should act, and doing is determined by a structure, it happens that everything becomes the structure and the should be. When the structure is to understand and you start trying to know things before you live them, everything you live is the structure of knowing and understanding. The only way to learn about oneself is first to live and later to understand the living. It is as obvious as the thought that before understanding something it is necessary for it to be born. If that something has not been born and therefore does not exist, there is no way to understand it. To want to understand something that has not been born is only to understand the understanding. When someone lives without thinking about how he does it, he lets out what is inside him. It is only when this letting out occurs that what one is appears. It is in those moments that the way one acts, what one says, and what provokes grace or anger shows freely and truly what exists inside. If someone wishes to know himself, it is necessary that he first learns to let out, without restrictions, what he has inside. Unrestricted means that he does not try to understand it at the moment he is living it. When, after having lived, the experience is analyzed, it is understood. If, on the other hand, one tries to understand an experience that one has not had, one only makes a falsehood. In order to understand an experience that one has had, it is not enough to wish to do so. It is necessary that the analysis be free and unprejudiced, that is, without any pre-established structure or logical pattern. The reason for the latter is because understanding is also an experience of freedom. We are used to hearing that freedom is the ideal, that only by achieving it can one be happy. Almost always, the freedom referred to is related to breaking a restriction or a physical impediment. Reaching the state of freedom, in those terms, implies a state of uninhibited movement. The truth of the matter is that the true state of freedom is, more than anything else, internal. Freedom, as the absence of external or physical restraint or inhibition, is a very primitive concept. The deep sense of the idea of freedom implies an experience of subtraction and the rejection of all authority. To be free means to trust that what one feels, thinks, or acts has the highest value. It implies the consideration that nothing other than oneself can define what is right or wrong, desirable or detestable, good or bad. When this state is reached, one does not accept to submit to or exercise any authority, since one recognizes the meaninglessness and falsity of such authority. To be free implies being able to act and feel without restrictions, without deciding structures, without subjection or ideals, goals, or moral or religious considerations. The object of being free is to be able to learn from what surrounds us and from ourselves. Only the free person comes to know himself, since he lets out his true essence and his real self. In doing so, he can understand his reality because he lets it be born and allows it to manifest itself. The lack of inner freedom results in the impossibility of learning. From the dream. At the beginning of ontogenetic development, the human being spends most of his time in sleep. The characteristics of sleep in a newborn are identical to those found in an adult subject, at least as far as behavioral, electroencephalographic, and electromyographic activity is concerned. It is not the silent sleep known as slow sleep, but the other one which is accompanied in the adult by images and internal experiences. We do not know if during sleep the neonate has internal images and experiences like those of the adult. All we know is that the activity we can detect is identical. As he grows, man begins to spend part of his time in the waking state, decreasing concomitantly the time of dreaming with images. It would seem, therefore, that wakefulness arises from sleep and is a particular case of it. Perhaps for this reason, the dreams we dream never lose their connection with their byproduct, that is, with wakefulness. Perhaps the relationship between the two states is not random, but one of complement and necessity. We develop in a society that demands and reinforces control and inhibition. Our thought processes during wakefulness are always subordinated to the structure that attaches the utmost importance to the safeguarding of stable and secure situations, and that fears any situation of internal and external freedom. We are taught to interact with the people around us through the acceptance and internalization of rules of interaction that were invented to avoid friction. Moreover, the training to which we are subjected implies the consideration that the important thing is not to manifest what we think or feel when these sensations or thoughts oppose the rules and agreements of socialization. Since we continue to experience them in spite of not manifesting them, a situation of conflict and contradiction is created between two experiential spheres, the external and the internal. Dreams could have the function of diminishing the conflict through the disinhibition of control. During sleep we are free. It is the freedom that we have been taught to discard in wakefulness. In the dream we know ourselves, because during its occurrence appears what we really are. Of the opposites and the experiences. According to Lao Tse, everyone takes the beautiful for the beautiful, and so they know what the ugly is. Everyone takes the good for the good, and so they know what evil is. It cannot be in a different way. Only when one has lived a reality can one know. If I have known love, I can know when it has disappeared and become hate. If I have lived goodness, I can know when it ceases to exist and evil appears. If, on the other hand, I have not experienced an emotion, I will be unable to detect its presence, its absence, or its opposite, either in myself or in the other. Knowledge is certainty, and certainty only appears when something has been experienced. If I doubt, it means that I do not know. If I am able to see what exists and to know when it has ceased to exist, it means that I know it because I have experienced it. If I raise questions and put myself in doubt, it means that I have not lived enough. Of understanding and change. Just as there is only one type of knowledge, that which is based on certainties and not on data, in the same way there is only one way of understanding, that which makes us change. When someone tells us what he has learned and we simply hear it, and although it seems logical and intellectually reasonable to us, it does not make us change. It means that we have not understood it. What is the point of hearing and seeing if what we see and hear remains seeing and hearing? What is the point of finding the logic of a reasoning if all that is achieved is to find the logic? What is the sense of knowing data if they do not become experiences? We can tell someone that he should not be afraid. If, despite the fact that he agrees with us, he continues to fear, the only thing we will have achieved by speaking will be to move the molecules of the air. Does this mean that the word is only a word and cannot be converted into action and change? There are those who think so. I, for my part, think that the word is a tool, and that its capacity to provoke real change does not depend on the word itself, but on the person who receives it. Someone can change by hearing, another can only change by falling out of an airplane. But change does not depend on hearing or falling, but on the sensitivity of the one who hears or the one who falls. From knowing that one knows. There is a degree of knowledge superior to any other. It is the wisdom of one's own knowledge. It is the knowledge that one knows. When someone manages to reach it, reaches the level of certainty, stops doubting and begins to be free. This degree of knowledge does not apply or refer to concrete events, but rather is related to general aspects. It is the certainty that the essence exists in everyone as equal, or it is the knowledge that in everyone the world is constructed, or it is the confidence in the existence of inner experiences, or it is the certainty that many behaviors still depend on personal history. Knowing that one knows is not a degree of clarity that prevents knowledge, but rather a state of openness and disinhibition that facilitates it. It is simply a level of self-respect and self-confidence. From authority. Yesterday, I had a dream. It was a room in a house. Everything was occupied by chairs, and on the wall hung the most beautiful painting I have ever seen. It was a gigantic oil painting in which 6 men were painted. Each one had a different expression, but all of them reflected depth and serenity. People came into the room. Each one stood in front of the painting, knelt down and kissed the floor. Then they would go to the place where the chairs were and sit on one of them. The same scene was repeated until all the chairs were occupied. We all watched the painting. The oil painting began to live. The painted figures moved, and the one in the center began to speak. What she said I don't remember, but it was sensible, reasonable, and profound. We were all amazed. We thought that the organization to which the house, the painting, and the chairs belonged was powerful and wise, because it managed to give life to an oil painting. I got up from my chair and approached the painting. On one side of the frame there was a door. I opened it and went inside a small room where there was a movie projector pointing towards the back of the painting. I realized that the whole thing was a farce. Between the projector and the painting was some kind of optical filter. I took it and removed it from its place. Then I went out to the room with the chairs and looked at the painting. The figures were still moving and talking, but the luminosity was such that the illusion of reality had been lost. The members of the organization started shouting at me, the people in the chairs too. They were telling me to put the filter back in place or else I would suffer the consequences. Everyone looked very unhappy and unhappy. I took the filter and put it back in place. The figures in the painting looked real again. I turned to see the people in the chairs. They were happy. I saw the people in the organization. They were satisfied. From the external events. In the objects and events that surround us is contained all the information, but in us is the knowledge. A drop of water, a flower, or a mountain are almost infinite in their possibility of giving us information. Whether we learn from them depends on our ability to see them without limitations, prejudices, or preconceived ideas. A river can teach us, like Siddhartha, that everything remains, but at the same time changes, that everything returns to its place of origin, or that everything is contained within itself. That we can learn from the river is not in the river itself, it is only in ourselves. If we were able to understand it perfectly, every minute of our life would be absolute fullness, total happiness, that is, freedom. From the Bible. According to the Bible, man lost paradise the instant he gained knowledge. This idea, although apparently absurd, has great depth. Childhood, in man, is a paradise in the happiest sense of the term. The infant learns and knows the world without thinking that he himself is learning from it or knowing it. What he does and feels is in himself, without self-censorship, self-inhibition, or self-valuation. In other words, at this stage there is no difference between the observed and the observer, because there is no self-expectation. The child is one with the world that surrounds him, since he has not developed a mechanism that allows the emergence of the duality of the internal self versus the external self. In the adult, on the contrary, the phenomenon of being a spectator of the self has developed to such a degree that it rarely ceases to function. The adult claims to have knowledge of the world by feeling capable of valuing it, when in reality the only thing he has developed is the unfortunate habit of observing himself and adjusting to logical intellectual structures. In this situation, the only thing he achieves is the separation between himself and the world around him, that is, the loss of innocence and of the capacity to create and live freely. If the type of knowledge to which the Bible refers is that related to seeing oneself knowing, then the Bible is right. Paradise has been lost. From drugs. The great tendency to use drugs in our time has a reason for being. Our mechanized, homogenized, standardized, technified, and objectified culture teaches its members to consider the pragmatic and the communicable as the highest value. It emphasizes that man requires structure and agreement to be happy, and forgets that the only happiness is development, respect, and trust in the inner reality. The man of our time is a spectator of himself. This self-spectation is made according to how the outside, the people, perceives and values him. Our civilizations and culture teach us to distrust our internal processes, considering them subjective and lacking in value, and to rely on agreement and structured external observation as the only worthy one. The teachings that make us spectators of ourselves are based on the idea that the only reality is the one that manifests itself and provokes agreement among several observers. One sees oneself doing things, feeling or thinking as if one were one of the observers, which precludes doing, feeling, or thinking. It is not the feeling of stepping outside oneself and recognizing objectively and clearly the structures and prejudices one has fallen into. We do not mean this when we speak of being a spectator of oneself. It is rather the academic situation of self-valuation conditioned by structures that we refer to. It is the sacrifice of pure inner living for the sake of logic, structure, and valuation that is objected to. Man needs to live without thinking or valuing living. He needs to be able to see the world purely, that is, without thinking about whether he is seeing it, and whether or not this vision conforms to morality, religion, the state, or any other structure. Since our society inhibits and censures pure experience, and the great need to have it remains, a conflict is created that in a great number of cases is attempted to be solved through the use of drugs. The use of drugs is not caused deep down by the desire to flee from reality, but rather by the need to live it without being a spectator of the experience of living it. From death. According to Krishnamurti, it is necessary to die in life in order to be free. This thought, apparently necrophilic, has great depth. Throughout our development, we have been bombarded by thousands of imposing considerations. We have been taught that there are good things and bad things, that the only way to be is to achieve positions of power, whether economic, political, or intellectual. We have learned to fear and to hate, to be jealous and to envy. They have imposed on us the idea that the value and essence that we are given by the way others perceive and evaluate us. We have been taught to be insecure, and therefore to be depressed, anguished, and disrespected. We learn that love implies possession and use, and so on. All this series of teachings and learnings constitute our history. The only way to free ourselves from all of them is to let that past die. Only that death in life will set us free. From language. We speak of a forest as a single entity reducible to a category, when in reality it is an infinite set of different units that in themselves are independent of each other. We refer to Fulanita as Juan, Pedro, Ignacio, Rodolfo, etc., as if it were possible to reduce his humanity to a name, and as if this, like the name, were stable, fixed, and immutable. It would seem that communicating requires such reductionism to be possible. An expert in human communication would consider his activity chaotic if he did not use discrete semantic categories, which include hundreds of entities. How, he would ask us, would it be possible to communicate if we lacked stable and reductionist denominations? If, in order to speak of Zutano, we had to give all his characteristics as they exist at the moment we do so, we would fall, he would tell us, into the most monstrous absurdity, since it would take us years to transmit any idea. Such an expert could be asked what is the sense of communication based on fixed and reductionist categories, when we know beforehand that it is unreal because it is biased and static. It is true that non-categorized communication would be slower, but perhaps that would teach us to communicate only the authentic, i.e., that which does not require the opposite to be understandable. Our language is full of terms that reduce to a linguistic unit what in reality is irreducible. The habit of using them would be serious enough just for having an aberrant effect on our communication. But its true terrifying character consists in the fact that it alters and distorts our perception of the world. It causes it to be perceived as made up of simple, static, and therefore redundant conglomerates. When this redundant character is transferred from the objects around us to our experiences, the situation becomes dramatic. We begin to see ourselves as a set of categories that are not only identified with a term, but are also considered explained and known by the simple fact of verbalizing the linguistic unit, name, that we use to denominate them. Since names are unitary and stable, that is also what the experiences, feelings, emotions, or objects named by them become. Thus, we can feel our depression, our anguish, or our love as unitary and static quantum categories, forgetting that they are so only with our language and never in themselves. When we teach a child to speak, we not only give him a superficial means of communication, but above all, we transmit to him a whole experiential philosophy in which we include all our reductionist categorizations. The child, thus taught, faces the horrible dilemma of sacrificing all his perceptual, experiential, and phenomenological richness in order to use the language we impose on him, or to keep it, even if he is considered an abnormal and pathological case for refusing to communicate what in reality is incommunicable. This does not mean that language is aberrant in itself. Rather, it is the use that is made of it that gives it this character. If we were able to truly separate the linguistic unit from what it tries to represent, and if we did not reduce to simple categories that which is not reducible, our language would have the real quality for which it was invented and developed. Of the reality of dreams. In the same way that the color of an object is not contained in the wavelength of the light it reflects, but rather in the internal experience created from this wavelength, so all the qualities of physical objects, such as texture, smell, form, etc., result from the experiential transformation that occurs within us and not in the object itself. This means that the reality of the world as we perceive it is the product of our internal construction, and as such is no different from the internal construction associated with extravigilant states, such as those that occur during dreams. Dream reality does not differ from vigil reality in more than one point. During sleep we are absolutely cause. During wakefulness we may cease to be cause. When we dream, we create the universe in such a complete and real way that we not only construct what in wakefulness, i.e., the qualities of objects, but we also construct the objects themselves. The construction of reality is more complete in sleep than during wakefulness. That is the only difference between the two states. It is a fact. All other differences generally attributed to the two states result from structures, agreements, and preconceived ideas. Prophets, visionaries, and those who claim to have astral travels differ from ordinary people in the fact that they respect their dreams more, and therefore do not consider them unreal. They are not strange and unreachable people. They have simply understood that there is only one reality, which is constructed and results from our inner processes. From self-knowledge through observation. So-and-so is self-complacent, but does not realize it. Zutanito lives in his past, but does not know it. Paranganito only feels satisfied if he obtains the approval of others, but he has never thought about it. None of the three know or understand each other, for the simple reason that they are unable to see themselves from a point of view different from the one they have always used. Moreover, they consider that another point of view cannot exist since they have never known any other than the one they use. If they have ever had a relationship with someone different from themselves, they have not realized the difference because they have seen the other from the only point of reference they know, and therefore have included in their observation what coincides with it, and have discarded what does not correlate. These people have never loved. They have probably possessed and used others, but they surely do not know what love is. Love is self-knowledge. A loving relationship is one in which the participants know themselves through the knowledge that each has of the other. For that to happen, the knowledge must be based on and arise from free observation, that is, from the absence of prejudice and preconception. Love is not an exchange of reinforcement or pleasures, nor is it agreement or compromise, still less is it the satisfaction of needs. It is rather self-knowledge based on free observation. If Fulanita, Zutanito, and Paranganito loved, they would know that one point of reference is not more important or valuable than another. They are simply different. If they knew love, they would know themselves, since they would recognize in themselves points of reference, structures and agreements that do not exist or that are different in those they observe and love. From the redundancy. Redundant knowledge is that which comes back on itself in a circle whose beginning connects with its end. Each of us has been trained to perceive and feel the world in a very particular and specific way. Our relationships with others are generally based on these rigid frames of reference. In turn, frames of reference are supported by previous learning that fixes the characteristics of a human relationship or any other activity. Since everything is determined beforehand, nothing new happens, and if it happens at all, it is discarded because it does not conform to the frames of reference conditioned by our history. It is necessary to understand it well. When the experience is based on thought, nothing other than that thought can occur. If thought is based on structures, only structures will exist. Everything that happens will be seen through the structure, and therefore nothing new will occur, and everything will be redundancy. If we function according to theoretical models, all we do will be to conform to those models or adjust any external contingency to approximate what we want it to be. In this circumstance, it is our past and our history that are present, and never what surrounds us. We are a prison of models, thoughts, and preconceived ideas, and the prison is the only thing that exists for us. It is only at the moment when we stop thinking about how things should be that redundancy ends and we begin to learn. From imagination and memory. All imaginative processes are the result of the activation of our mnemic stores. If someone closes his eyes and detects the image of a mountain, it means that it was stored in his brain cells. Sometimes the images thus evoked are astonishingly complete and detailed, as much or more than those originated during a perceptual process. This extraordinary capacity indicates that our memory stores information as it enters the brain through our sensory channels. Our handling of such stored information is rarely as complete as would be expected if the information contained in the images were taken into account. If someone were to ask us for a verbal description or simply a drawing of any of our internal images, it would be exceptional if they contained the same or at least approximate information as the image. There must be some process that transforms the information in memory and gives rise to different evocations. In the passage from storage to evocation, there is loss in the sense of detail, precision, and total character of the information. I can evoke the image of a bicycle, having all the detail and content of a real bicycle. In the image, there is the exact number of links that form the steel chain, the number and length of the spokes of the wheels, and so on. This means that all this information is stored in me. However, if someone were to ask me about the number of links or spokes, I would not be able to answer. That means that the verbal evocation is not a direct copy of the stored information, but an incomplete transformation of it. Probably the reason for this is that verbal evocation works in terms of reductionist categories, whereas the stored information is not categorized in itself, but is found as it is perceived, that is to say, with all the elements that form any object. Categorization comes later, as the handling of information that in itself does not belong to any category. If the categorization of information were contained in the original storage, there would be no possibility of subsequent regrouping or creative handling, different from that of the primary categorization. Since the stored information can be recategorized as often as desired, the original storage is not categorized. The difference between the evocation of a visual image and its verbalization, besides being made in terms of categories, is determined according to the freedom of the process. Verbalization is subject to strict rules. The image is not. The rules are responsible for the loss of information in verbalization. The lack of them is the cause of the extraordinary informative content of an image. Of decisions. Since the experience of what happens in my body is constructed in my brain, my brain can change that construction. If the experience is of pain, for example, in a leg, the pain is not located in the leg, but rather inside the brain. It is there that the pain is constructed. The signals that originate this construction may well come from the leg, but the experience is always the result of central activation. While the brain can construct pain, it is also capable of modifying or overriding it. Whether it does so or not depends on whether it chooses to do so. For change to occur, the decision must be absolute, i.e., without doubt. The brain itself must be sure that it is the constructor in order to be the modifier as well. Of time and thought. It is not that thought lasts nothing. What happens is that time does not exist, or at least it does not exist as a constant. If it were a physical constant, psychological time would also be one, and in reality it is not. I can feel that 2 days have passed when my watch will only have ticked a few minutes, or on the contrary, 2 days can pass, and I will feel that it has only been 2 minutes. Who should I listen to, the mechanical clock or my certainty? Of creation and knowledge. The ultimate satisfaction is the creation of a painting, a symphony, an idea, an image, a dream, and it is so because the one who creates is really one, and this activity of ours is the source of all beauty. To create implies making something out of nothing. Before existing, not even as an image in the painter, a painting is nothing. It is only when that image appears or when it is transformed into an oil painting that it is born. This act of creation is unlike any other. What one feels during its occurrence cannot be described, but it surely constitutes the most satisfying emotion anyone can have. Every act of creation is accompanied by the same sensation, regardless of its specific character. Thus, a reasoning about the reason for X process is, in itself, an act of creation, and as such, identical to that of an artistic or any other kind of creation. It is the experience that counts, not its intellectualized relation to an event or situation. To find the relationship between two or more variables is to create the relationship, for the simple reason that it does not exist physically. This creative act is neither more valuable nor less important than any other. Knowledge is this very creative act. It is not the accumulation of data, methods, information, or any other measurable and storable fact. True knowledge is perennial creation, since any knowledge is precisely a creative act. A man in a state of knowledge is he who has learned to create all the time, without limit, without interval. He is the originator of knowledge. From asking. Only he who does not know asks, he who knows no longer asks. Questions are not necessarily always between two question marks. Speaking can be a question. In fact, it is the constant questioning about the possibility of transmitting an inner experience. Therefore, he who speaks does so because he does not know. Only he who knows does not speak. Knowing is not an intellectual understanding, it is rather a not asking, not verbalizing, that is, not reducing. The state of knowing is intangible, immaterial, averible, and, dare I say it, unconscious. A person is what he does not verbalize, what he does not ask, what he does not show to show. That is why one should not invalidate as non-existent that which is not heard, seen, understood, or felt, especially as far as knowledge of another person is concerned. The other person is that which does not try to transmit, that which does not know it exists, that which is silent. Of feeling and analysis. It is when one begins to doubt that one tries to make an intellectual analysis. It is when one stops feeling that one begins to question. It is only when one lives intensely and authentically, when questions, intellectual analysis, and logic are no longer necessary. When you doubt and wonder about the value of things, it is because you stop feeling and try to bring the feeling back. There is no point in making an effort. feeling is not the result of an act of will or a decision. It is another dimension that appears or does not appear, but freely, never under coercion or imposition. That is why there is no point in deceiving oneself by forcing sensations and feelings. Doing so has only one consequence: nullity. From not seeing. When someone invalidates you and makes you feel bad, it only shows that he is neither seeing you nor listening to you. You are, for him, a mere reflection of his own vision, a tentacular prolongation of his point of reference. The person who sees you this way does not know how to learn from you, perhaps because he does not know how to learn from himself. The world, for her, exists only as a reflection of a redundant and closed model that she has created of it, or as an idea or preconception of how it should be. The world does exist, but it is one who learns from it. When one stops learning from the world, it means that one has destroyed it. From the conditions of learning. Learning from a person is only possible when two conditions are met. A. That the one from whom one learns is authentic, that is, that he does not want to teach, and B. That the one who learns does not introduce the other into a category, model, or value. To be authentic implies being without questioning or analyzing. Indeed, only the one who does not know that he is being authentic, who does not need to know it because he is authentic. But that is not enough to learn. It is necessary for the learner to be humble, that is, not to think he knows what he is going to learn, and even less how this learning should be. The reason for this is obvious. To learn is to create, and creation in essence is the appearance of something new, something that does not exist except at the moment it appears. It is to give life to something that cannot be predicted, since if it were possible to predict it, it would cease to be creation, and would become mere repetition. From love. Love is neither jealousy nor need, nor possession, nor agreement, nor struggle. Love cannot be played with. It only appears when things coincide, when one is able to create and to see, not with eyes of desire, but with lack of need, simply to see. When this happens, love loses its monogamous character, it becomes universal, and for everyone. There are no limitations or requirements to fulfill. Love is a coincidence of states of being. It is an understanding without doubts or restrictions, without structures or agreements. Love is a creative act. It is the construction of something from nothing. The end. If you liked this audiobook, share it with the people you appreciate the most. Thank you for following the channel Bending Realities. A big hug, and may the infinite wisdom of the Creator guide you always.